Good evening, friends. Tonight, we descend into the Vatican's most forbidden archive, a place where even cardinals fear to tread. Here, beneath layers of marble and centuries of silence, lie the Egyptian codices that once made Pope Gregory IX declare in 1231. These texts hold powers that make the devil himself seem ordinary. Picture this moment with me. It's 3 minutes past midnight in Vatican City. The Swiss guards have completed their final rounds. The tourists are long gone, their cameras and whispered prayers replaced by an almost sacred stillness that seems to press against the very walls of St. Peter's. But tonight, we're not visiting the gilded halls where millions come to pray. We're going deeper, much deeper. Follow the shadow of a cardinal's robes as he moves through corridors that don't appear on any tourist map. His footsteps echo against marble floors, worn smooth by 8 centuries of secretive pilgrimages. Count with me as we descend. 1, 2, 3. 73 steps down from the Apostolic Palace, each step taking us further from the world of faith and closer to the realm of forbidden knowledge. The air grows colder with each step. At step 30, you can still smell the incense from evening vespers. At step 50, that warmth fades, replaced by something ancient, the scent of papyrus older than Christ himself, mixed with the metallic tang of iron that has known no rust for 1,000 years. At step 73, we stop before doors that have no equal anywhere on earth. These are not ordinary doors. 3 inches of solid iron, forged in the fires of medieval Rome, sealed with locks that have no keys. You see, the Vatican learned long ago that some knowledge is too dangerous for keys. These locks respond only to ancient words, spoken in languages that predate Latin itself. Words that were old when the pyramids were young. Listen carefully, and you might hear it. The whisper of air moving through chambers that exist in perfect silence 364 days of the year. But tonight is different. Tonight, someone has spoken those ancient words. The doors swing open on hinges that make no sound. Inside, the darkness is absolute, broken only by the flame of a single candle that seems to burn with a light too steady, too pure to be entirely natural. The flame reveals shelves that stretch beyond the reach of mortal vision, filled with texts that scholars dream of but dare not name in daylight. Here, in this vault beneath the Vatican, temperature and humidity are controlled to the precision of a Swiss timepiece. Exactly 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Exactly 45% humidity. These conditions have been maintained without fail since the year of our Lord 1348, when Pope Clement VI first ordered the construction of this impossible archive. But why such precision? What knowledge demands such careful preservation? The answer lies in the texts themselves. Papyri that carbon dating places at 3,100 years before Christ. Scrolls written in hieroglyphs that describe miracles that would make the apostles themselves fall to their knees in wonder and terror. Documents that speak of resurrection rituals, of healing frequencies that can mend shattered bones with sound alone, of conversations with beings of pure light who claim to have walked among men when Egypt was young and Rome was nothing more than sheep paths on 7 hills. In the deepest corner of this archive sits a collection known only as the Egypticus Codices, 1,247 texts, catalogued with a precision that would make modern librarians weep with envy. Each text sealed in crystal-clear protective casings, each one bearing a small metal placard with a date, a brief description, and, most tellingly, a warning. The warnings vary, but they all share a common theme: restricted access by papal order. Translation forbidden. Contents may challenge fundamental church doctrine, but the most common warning, appearing on nearly half the collection, reads simply, dangerous to faith itself. What could be so dangerous to faith that the most powerful religious institution on earth would spend centuries hiding it? What knowledge could be so threatening that popes would rather preserve it in secret than destroy it outright? The answer begins with a desperate night in Alexandria, in the summer of 642 after Christ. Arab forces were approaching the Great Library, and a Coptic monk named Dioscorus made a choice that would echo through the centuries. a choice that would bring ancient Egyptian magic into the very heart of Christianity. But that night in Alexandria was not the beginning of this story. To understand why the Vatican fears Egyptian magic more than Satan himself, we must reach even further back, to the banks of the Nile, where priests of Heka practiced arts that they claimed were taught to them by gods whose names are older than writing itself. You see, the Egyptians didn't call it magic. They called it Heka, the force that spoke stars into existence, that gave life to clay, that made the impossible merely improbable. To them, Heka was not supernatural, but supremely natural, the fundamental force that underlies all creation. Their priests didn't pray to gods so much as they conversed with aspects of cosmic intelligence that pervaded every grain of sand, every drop of river water, every breath of desert wind. When Roman legions first encountered these texts during Constantine's campaigns, soldiers reported phenomena that their commanders ordered never to be recorded in official dispatches. Healings that happened in moments, conversations with deceased Romans who spoke of things no living person could know, demonstrations of knowledge about distant lands and future events that proved accurate down to the smallest detail. Constantine himself, that first Christian emperor, ordered his most trusted bishops to examine these texts. Bishop Hosius of Cordoba wrote in his private journal, a document that now rests 3 shelves to the left of where our cardinal stands tonight. These papyri describe miracles that surpass even Christ's. If this knowledge is demonic, why does it heal the sick and comfort the grieving? If it is divine, why was it not revealed to us through Jesus? I fear we have stumbled upon a mystery that our faith has no words to contain. That mystery has haunted the Vatican for 1700 years. Why did the Vatican fear Egyptian magic more than Satan himself? Tonight, you'll discover the answer through the very words of popes who dared to read these forbidden texts and lived to regret it. But first, we must return to that desperate summer night in Alexandria, when a monk named Dioscorus loaded 47 scrolls onto a Roman ship called the Constantia and set in motion a chain of events that would force the Catholic Church to confront a question that would shake the very foundations of Christian faith. What if the Egyptians were right? What if magic isn't the work of demons, but the science of angels? The candle flame flickers once, casting dancing shadows across texts that have waited centuries to tell their stories. In that flicker, you might glimpse the outline of hieroglyphs that seem to move in the uncertain light, symbols that promise answers to questions humanity is only now learning to ask. The monk Dioscorus awaits us, there in the harbour at Alexandria, with his precious cargo and his impossible choice. But that is a story for the next chamber of our journey into the Vatican's deepest secrets. Summer, 642 AD. The Mediterranean air hangs heavy with smoke and the promise of conquest as Arab forces under Amr ibn al-As draw closer to Alexandria, the crown jewel of ancient learning. In the great library's innermost sanctum, a man stands at the crossroads of history, his trembling hands holding the weight of human knowledge itself. Brother Dioscorus, 43 years old, his fingers stained black with ink from decades of copying sacred texts, stares at the scrolls that surround him like silent witnesses to the end of an age. The torchlight flickers across papyrus that has survived floods, fires, and the rise and fall of empires, yet tonight faces its greatest threat, the religious fervour of conquerors who see in these ancient texts nothing but the work of devils. But Dioscorus knows better. He has spent his life translating these documents, and he understands that what lies within these fragile sheets is not demonic. It is miraculous. Here are healing formulas that can restore sight to the blind using nothing but precisely calibrated sound frequencies. Here are resurrection techniques that describe, in methodical detail, how to recall the recently departed back to physical life. Here are instructions for multiplying food, for walking on water, for commanding the very elements themselves, all recorded by Egyptian priests 15 centuries before Christ walked the dusty roads of Palestine. The monk's dilemma cuts deeper than fear for his own life. To leave these texts is to condemn humanity to lose knowledge that could heal every disease, end every famine, bring peace to every troubled heart. To take them is to risk not just his mortal existence, but perhaps his very soul. For who is he, a simple Coptic monk, to judge which ancient wisdom deserves preservation? As the harbour bells toll midnight, their bronze voices carrying across water dark as obsidian, Dioscorus makes the choice that will echo through 17 centuries of Christian history. Moving with the desperate efficiency of a man who knows time is his enemy, he selects exactly 47 scrolls from the thousands that line these sacred walls. Not 46, not 48, 47, a number that appears again and again in both Egyptian mystical texts and Christian numerology, representing the completion of earthly wisdom and the gateway to divine understanding. His selection is not random. Each scroll has been tested, verified, documented in his private journal as containing knowledge that could transform human existence. The papyrus of Isis healing, its surface so fine it feels like silk beneath his touch, contains formulas for curing diseases that medical science won't identify for another 1,000 years. The scroll of Thoth's wisdom describes mathematical principles that Newton will discover in 1687. The Testament of Horus details optical theories that Galileo will use to perfect his revolutionary telescope. But it is the 47th scroll that makes Dioscorus pause longest in the flickering candlelight. Written in hieroglyphs so ancient that even he can barely decipher them, this text bears a title that translates roughly as "The True Names of the Star Walkers." It claims to record the actual words spoken by beings who descended from the celestial realm to teach humanity the arts of civilization, the same beings who, according to the text, walked among men during the time of Enoch and promised to return when humanity had evolved enough to receive their complete teachings. Through Alexandria's twisting streets, past Roman guards too drunk on victory wine to challenge a simple monk carrying what appears to be a leather satchel of personal belongings, Dioscorus makes his way toward the harbour. The city around him burns with a dozen small fires as looters claim their prizes. But the monk sees only the path ahead, illuminated by a fog that seems too thick, too luminous for a summer night. At the harbour's edge, shrouded in mist that swirls with an almost supernatural density, waits the merchant vessel Constantia. Her captain, Marcus Flavius, is a Christian sympathizer who has agreed to carry precious cargo to Rome, though he has not been told the true nature of what his ship will bear. The vessel herself seems touched by the otherworldly. Built in the traditional Roman style but modified with design elements that Marcus claims came to him in vivid dreams, the Constantia rides the waves with an unnatural stability that makes even experienced sailors whisper prayers of wonder. Her hull bears symbols that appear nowhere in Roman naval tradition, intricate patterns that Dioscorus recognizes from his years studying Egyptian maritime texts, spirals that represent the flow of cosmic energy, stars arranged in configurations that match the ceiling of the Temple of Dendera. Most curious of all, a series of hieroglyphs running along her waterline that spell out, in ancient Egyptian, "She who carries wisdom across the dark waters." It is as if the ship herself has been prepared by forces beyond human understanding for this singular voyage. As Dioscorus climbs aboard, his precious cargo clutched against his chest like a father protecting his children, the fog thickens until the harbour disappears entirely. The only sounds are the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the whispered prayers of sailors who sense they are part of something far greater than a simple merchant voyage. In the ship's hold, by the light of torches that burn with flames too steady for the ocean wind, Dioscorus arranges the 47 scrolls with the reverence of a priest preparing for Mass. Each papyrus is wrapped in silk blessed by Coptic bishops, then sealed in cedarwood boxes lined with aromatic resins that will preserve them for the journey ahead. As he works, the monk can feel power emanating from the texts like heat from a forge, not malevolent, but so intensely sacred that it makes his hands tremble and his prayers stumble on his lips. The voyage takes 23 days, an impossibly swift crossing that Marcus will later describe in his ship's log as guided by winds that answered to no earthly navigation. The Mediterranean, notorious for its sudden storms and treacherous currents, lies calm as polished glass throughout their passage. At night, when the sea reflects stars with perfect clarity. Crew members report seeing lights moving beneath the water in patterns that follow the ship's course, as if otherworldly escorts are guiding them toward their destiny. On the seventh night, as the Constantia cuts through water so still it seems solid, a sound rises from the hold where the scrolls rest. Not the creaking of wood or the settling of cargo, but something that can only be described as whispered conversation in a language none of the sailors recognize. The words seem to come from the papyri themselves, as if the ancient texts are communing with each other after centuries of silence. Dioscorus spends the voyage in prayer and preparation, knowing that what awaits in Rome will test his faith more surely than any martyrdom. In his private journal, which will eventually find its way into the Vatican archives alongside the scrolls themselves, he writes, "I carry wisdom that could end every human suffering, heal every disease, bring peace to every warring nation. Yet I fear it more than I would fear carrying Satan's own manuscripts. Not because it is evil. I have tested these techniques, seen their fruits, witnessed their compassion. I fear it because it is so profoundly good, so completely divine, that it might shatter everything we believe about God's exclusive revelation through Christ." Rome, autumn, 642 AD. The first snow of winter dusts the Seven Hills as Pope Theodore I, 93rd successor of St. Peter, receives the travel-stained monk from Alexandria in his private chambers. The Pope is a man who has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, who has navigated theological controversies that split the Church, who has experienced personal revelations that left him humbled before the infinite mystery of divine will. But nothing has prepared him for what the soft-spoken Coptic monk is about to reveal. The papal study is a sanctuary of Christian learning, its shelves lined with the accumulated wisdom of 6 centuries of faith. Manuscripts of the Church Fathers rest beside carefully preserved copies of apostolic letters. Candles burn in silver sconces, their light reflecting off illuminated texts created by the finest artists of the age. It is here, surrounded by the intellectual treasures of Christianity, that Pope Theodore first encounters knowledge that will forever change his understanding of divine revelation. Dioscorus unwraps the first scroll with hands that shake, not from fear, but from awe so profound it seems to bend the very air around him. The papyrus catches the candlelight and seems to glow with inner fire as hieroglyphs older than Moses become visible in the dancing shadows. As the monk begins to translate, his voice drops to barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might disturb powers that have slept since the building of the pyramids. "Your Holiness," Dioscorus says, his words measured and careful. "This text describes the resurrection of Osiris with details that match, word for word, the gospel accounts of our Saviour's triumph over death. But this papyrus has been dated by Roman scholars to 1500 years before Christ's birth. It speaks of a God who dies for the sins of his people, who rises again on the third day, who appears to his followers with a body both physical and transformed, and who promises eternal life to all who accept his sacrifice." The Pope's face grows pale in the flickering candlelight as he leans forward to examine the ancient writing. These are not vague similarities or symbolic parallels. They are exact matches. The Egyptian text describes Osiris's followers finding his tomb empty at dawn. It records appearances to disciples who initially doubt what they see. It details the transformed nature of the resurrection body, tangible yet transcendent, recognizable yet somehow beyond ordinary physical limitations. Most disturbing of all, the Egyptian account includes specific words spoken during these appearances, conversations that echo with haunting precision the dialogues recorded in the Christian Gospels. But where the Gospel accounts hint at deeper mysteries, the Egyptian version provides explicit details. It describes the exact process by which consciousness separates from the physical form at death, the precise timing required for successful resurrection, and most unnervingly, a systematic methodology that suggests resurrection was not a unique divine miracle, but a repeatable spiritual technology available to those with sufficient knowledge. As the night deepens and more scrolls are revealed, Pope Theodore feels his theological foundations shifting beneath him like sand. Here is the papyrus of divine healing, containing formulas for restoring sight to the blind, that require nothing more than the human voice calibrated to specific frequencies, combined with the laying on of hands in geometric patterns that channel what the text calls the creative vibration of the divine word. To test the monk's claims, Pope Theodore orders a blind beggar to be brought from the streets of Rome. What follows defies every assumption about the nature of miraculous healing. Using only the techniques described in the Egyptian papyrus, Dioscorus places his hands on the man's eyes, while intoning sounds that seem to resonate not just in the air, but in the very stones of the papal chamber. The healing unfolds gradually over the course of an hour, the beggar's cataracts dissolving like morning mist as sight returns in stages, first light and shadow, then shapes, finally full vision clearer than the man had possessed even in his youth. Yet throughout the entire procedure, not once does Dioscorus invoke the name of Christ or call upon Christian saints. The healing power seems to flow from the sounds themselves, from the specific hand positions, from what the Egyptian text describes as alignment with the frequencies through which the Creator spoke light into being. Here is the scroll of multiplication, describing how ancient priests fed thousands during times of famine by understanding what the papyrus calls the abundance frequency, a specific vibrational pattern that allegedly causes matter to replicate itself according to focused intention. The Pope recalls Christ's miracle of the loaves and fishes and feels his understanding of divine power tilting on its axis as he realizes that what Christianity calls miraculous, the Egyptians apparently considered a learnable skill. Most unsettling of all is the Testament of Consciousness Ascension, a text that describes in methodical detail how Egyptian initiates achieved direct communion with what they called the source intelligence, the cosmic consciousness from which all individual awareness springs. The process involves breathing techniques that alter brainwave patterns, meditation methods that expand perception beyond ordinary limits, and the use of sound frequencies to achieve what the text calls resonance with the divine frequency. The descriptions match with eerie precision the mystical experiences reported by Christian saints and desert hermits, visions of transcendent light, direct communication with angelic beings, the sensation of consciousness expanding to embrace all creation. But where Christian mystics achieve these states through years of ascetic struggle and divine grace alone, the Egyptian manual provides step-by-step instructions for producing them reliably, repeatedly, and without the suffering that Christian tradition considers necessary for spiritual advancement. As dawn light begins to filter through the stained glass windows of the papal chamber, Pope Theodore sits in stunned silence, his mind reeling with implications that threaten to transform everything he has believed about Christianity's unique relationship with the divine. Finally, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and wonder, he speaks the words that will be recorded in the Vatican's secret archives for centuries to come. Brother Dioscorus, what manner of knowledge burns with such cold fire? These texts, they describe miracles that I have seen attributed to Christ alone. They contain wisdom that surpasses the teachings of our greatest theologians. If this knowledge comes from demons, why does it heal the sick with greater consistency than our prayers? Why does it comfort the grieving more effectively than our sacraments? Why does it lead those who practice it toward love, compassion, and service to others, the very virtues that our Saviour taught? The monk's response echoes in the vaulted chamber like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples spreading outward to touch every corner of Christian understanding. Your Holiness, perhaps the question is not whether this knowledge comes from God or devil, but whether we have understood the nature of the divine as completely as we believed. Perhaps the creative intelligence that spoke through Jesus has always spoken to humanity through many voices, in many ages, through many teachers. Perhaps what we call revelation is not God's first word to humanity, but simply the most recent word we have been able to hear. The implications hang in the air like incense smoke, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to fully embrace. If Egyptian priests possessed divine wisdom 15 centuries before Christ's birth, what made Christian revelation unique? If ancient techniques could produce the same miracles attributed to Jesus, was the Son of God simply the most recent in a long line of enlightened teachers? And if direct communion with divine intelligence was a learnable skill rather than an exclusive gift of grace, what happened to the Church's role as sole mediator between God and humanity? Pope Theodore's decision will echo through the centuries. The 47 scrolls are to be placed in the deepest vaults beneath St. Peter's Basilica, protected by guards sworn to lifelong silence, studied by scholars bound by oaths of secrecy. But even as he gives the command, the Pope knows that this knowledge cannot be contained forever. Already he can feel it working in his consciousness like yeast in bread, expanding his understanding of the possible, forcing him to confront questions that have no comfortable answers. In his private journal, Theodore writes words that will haunt every pope who succeeds him. "I have gazed tonight into the face of mystery, and it is neither purely Christian nor purely pagan, but something far older and more wonderful than either. We are not the first to receive divine revelation, nor shall we be the last. The question that troubles my prayers is this: if the creative intelligence has always worked through multiple paths to reach human hearts, what does that say about our claim to be the one true way to salvation? The 47 scrolls rest now in chambers beneath chambers, behind doors that open only to ancient words, in vaults where temperature and humidity are controlled with precision that borders on the religious. Cardinals who study them find their prayers taking on new dimensions. Bishops who examine their healing formulas discover that their laying on of hands becomes more effective than ever before. And popes who dare to contemplate their implications must wrestle with revelations that could transform Christianity itself or shatter it entirely. These weren't just books that arrived in Rome that autumn night in 642 AD. They were doorways, gateways to understanding that human consciousness had been exploring the divine mystery long before Christ's incarnation, and had discovered techniques for spiritual development that the Church was only beginning to glimpse. The Vatican had just opened its first such doorway, but in the centuries to come, many more would follow. In the flickering shadows of the papal chamber, candlelight dances across hieroglyphs that seem to move with life of their own. And in that ancient writing, questions whisper that will reshape the Church's understanding of its place in the grand design of human spiritual evolution. What if divine revelation is not a single event, but an ongoing conversation? What if the techniques for communion with the sacred are not exclusive gifts, but universal birthrights? And what if the kingdom of heaven that Christ proclaimed is not a distant promise, but a state of consciousness that any human being can learn to enter? The monk Dioscorus returns to Alexandria, carrying with him only memories of that transformative night in Rome. But the questions he has planted in the heart of Christianity will grow like seeds in fertile ground, sprouting into centuries of secret investigation, hidden experimentation, and the gradual recognition that the divine mystery may be far more vast and accessible than any human institution has ever dared to imagine. But to understand how these questions would reshape the Church itself, we must journey deeper into the very foundations of Egyptian wisdom, into the nature of Heka, the force that ancient priests claimed spoke stars into existence and taught humanity the true arts of heaven. To understand why 47 scrolls from Alexandria could shake the foundations of Christianity itself, we must journey back through the mists of time to the very banks of the Nile, 3 millennia before Christ walked the dusty roads of Palestine. Here, in temples whose limestone blocks still stand as monuments to impossible engineering, Egyptian priests developed what they called Heka, not magic as we might imagine it, but something far more profound and infinitely more dangerous to established religious thought. Picture the Temple of Ptah at Memphis in the year 1350 before Christ. The sacred complex rises from the desert like a vision carved from golden stone, its walls decorated with hieroglyphs that seem to pulse with inner life under the dancing flames of countless oil lamps. Inside the temple's innermost sanctuary, where only the highest initiates are permitted to tread, High Priest Kamwaset stands before an altar carved from a single block of red granite quarried from the distant cataracts of Aswan. But this is no ordinary religious ceremony. What Kamwaset is performing, surrounded by papyrus scrolls covered in calculations that wouldn't look out of place in a modern physics laboratory, is something that would be recognized by 21st century quantum scientists as applied consciousness research. The Egyptians called it Heka, and they understood it to be the fundamental creative force that underlies all existence, not supernatural, but supremely natural, the cosmic energy that spoke stars into being and continues to maintain the delicate balance between matter and consciousness. The word Heka itself appears in Egyptian texts dating back more than 5,000 years, defined not as magic in our modern sense, but as the energy of creation itself, the primordial force through which thought becomes reality, through which divine intention manifests as physical form. To the Egyptian mind, Heka was as real and measurable as the annual flooding of the Nile, as predictable as the rising of Sirius, as fundamental as the heartbeat that sustains human life. In the scrolls that now rest in Pope Theodore's deepest vaults lies evidence of this understanding that would revolutionize modern science if it were ever released to the world. The Papyrus of Thoth describes matter not as solid substance, but as condensed light thought, a concept that Einstein will struggle to articulate in his theory of relativity 12 centuries later. The Memphis Codex explains consciousness not as a byproduct of brain chemistry, but as a fundamental force that shapes reality through focused intention, an idea that quantum mechanics is only now beginning to explore through studies of observer effect and consciousness-matter interaction. But it is in the practical applications of Heka that the true revolution lies hidden, waiting like a seed beneath winter snow. The Vatican's Egyptian collection contains detailed instructions for what can only be called technologies of consciousness, methodical procedures for healing the sick through sound frequencies precisely calibrated to cellular resonance, techniques for communicating across vast distances through what the texts call thought streaming, and most disturbing of all, step-by-step procedures for what the Egyptians matter-of-factly describe as resurrection of the dead. The pyramid texts, carved into the stone chambers beneath the Great Pyramid 1,500 years before Moses received the Ten Commandments, contain the most complete description of resurrection techniques ever recorded by human civilization. These are not vague spiritual allegories or symbolic representations of metaphysical truths. They are precise technical manuals, written with the methodical attention to detail of modern surgical procedures. The texts describe the exact timing required after physical death, 72 hours for the life force to complete its separation from bodily tissue, followed by a critical 12-hour window, during which the departed consciousness can be recalled back to physical form. They detail the specific sound frequencies needed to reactivate cellular metabolism, tones that must be intoned in precise mathematical progressions, while the body is positioned to align with magnetic field lines that flow through the earth itself. They even include detailed diagrams showing the energy pathways through which life force must be channeled to reanimate dead tissue without causing the cellular breakdown that normally accompanies decomposition. When Cardinal Toretti, Pope Theodore's most trusted scholar of ancient languages, first translated these resurrection passages in the winter of 643 AD, he wrote in his private journal words that would haunt the Vatican for centuries to come. These texts describe, with the precision of a Greek medical treatise, the exact process by which our Lord Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Every detail matches the Gospel accounts: the 3-day period, the appearance of the resurrected body as both physical and transformed, the precise nature of the disciples' encounters with their risen Master. But these Egyptian instructions were carved in stone 15 centuries before our Saviour's birth. Either Christ followed ancient Egyptian protocols in his resurrection, or these priests somehow witnessed his future triumph over death and recorded it prophetically in their temples. The implications struck at the very heart of Christian uniqueness. If resurrection was a technique that could be learned and applied, rather than a unique miracle of divine intervention, what did that say about the central claim of Christian salvation? If ancient Egyptians possessed step-by-step instructions for conquering death itself, were they practicing advanced spiritual science or communing with demonic forces? The answer seemed to lie in another text that would torment Vatican scholars for generations: the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. This small rectangular piece of green stone, covered with hieroglyphs so archaic that even Egyptian priests of the Ptolemaic period considered them ancient, supposedly contained the fundamental operating principles of the universe itself, condensed into 13 lines of cryptic instruction. That which is below is like that which is above, the tablet begins, and that which is above is like that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of the one thing. What follows is a formula that describes the process by which consciousness shapes matter, thought becomes reality, and the divine intelligence that created the cosmos operates through the same laws that govern human awareness. Medieval alchemists would spend their lives trying to decode this formula, believing it contained the secret of transmuting lead into gold. They were both wrong, and spectacularly right. The tablet contained something far more valuable than mere metallic transformation. It described the process by which human consciousness itself could be transmuted into divine awareness, achieving what the text calls participation in the solar nature, or direct communion with the creative intelligence of the universe. The tablet's instructions are deceptively simple yet profound beyond easy comprehension. Through specific meditation techniques that alter brainwave patterns, breathing exercises that modify blood chemistry, and the use of crystalline structures to focus electromagnetic fields around the human body, ordinary awareness can supposedly be elevated to what the text calls the frequency of the gods. At this level of consciousness, the practitioner can allegedly manipulate matter through thought alone, heal diseased tissue through focused intention, and ultimately transcend the limitations of physical death by maintaining conscious awareness in purely spiritual form. When Roman legions first encountered these texts during Constantine's campaigns in Egypt, 3 centuries before Dioscorus's desperate journey, the results were immediate and unsettling. Soldiers who had spent their careers witnessing the brutal realities of warfare returned to Rome with reports that challenged everything Romans understood about the nature of reality itself. Marcus Aurelius Maximus, a centurion stationed at Memphis, wrote to his brother in Rome, "The Egyptian priests perform miracles that make our legends of the gods seem like children's stories. Yesterday, I watched a man named Kiti restore sight to 3 soldiers blinded by Greek fire, using nothing but his voice pitched to specific tones, and his hands moved in patterns that seemed to draw light from empty air. The procedure took less than 2 hours, and now these men see better than they did before their injury." When I asked Katie if this was magic, he laughed and said it was simply knowledge, the application of laws we Romans have never learned, because we prefer to conquer with swords, rather than understand with minds. Even more disturbing were reports of Egyptian priests demonstrating knowledge of distant events with impossible accuracy. A priest named Anku correctly predicted the outcome of battles taking place hundreds of miles away, described in precise detail the contents of sealed messages before they were opened, and most unnervingly, spoke of future events that later proved accurate down to the smallest particulars. "They claim," wrote Centurion Gaius Flavius in his official dispatch, "that consciousness is not confined to the physical brain, but operates through what they call the K-body, a field of awareness that can expand beyond normal spatial limitations. Through techniques they teach in their temples, they say any person can learn to perceive events occurring at great distances, communicate directly mind to mind with others, and even glimpse probable futures by understanding the patterns through which present actions ripple into tomorrow's realities." When Constantine himself, that first Christian emperor, received these reports in 313 AD, the same year he legalized Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, he faced a dilemma that would define the relationship between Christianity and ancient wisdom for the next 17 centuries. If Egyptian priests could perform miracles that matched or exceeded those attributed to Christ, what made Christian revelation unique? If ancient techniques could heal the sick, raise the dead, and provide direct access to divine intelligence, what role remained for the Church as sole mediator between God and humanity? Constantine's response was characteristically decisive and politically astute. He ordered his most trusted bishops to examine these Egyptian texts with the utmost secrecy, seeking to determine whether they contained genuine divine wisdom demonic deceptions, or merely clever human inventions. The task fell primarily to Bishop Hosius of Córdoba, Constantine's closest theological advisor and one of the most learned men of his age. Bishop Hosius spent 8 months studying the 127 Egyptian texts that Roman soldiers had gathered from Memphis temples. His final report, sealed in the Vatican archives and never publicly released, contained conclusions that would chill the blood of every church leader who read it over the succeeding centuries. Your Imperial Majesty, these papyri describe miracles that surpass even those performed by our Lord Jesus Christ. They contain healing techniques that restore sight to the blind more rapidly than our Saviour's touch, formulas for multiplying food that could feed armies with greater abundance than the miracle of loaves and fishes, and most troubling of all, detailed instructions for raising the dead that appear more systematic and reliable than the resurrections recorded in Holy Scripture. But the bishop's most disturbing conclusion went to the heart of Christian uniqueness. If this knowledge is demonic, why does it heal the sick and comfort the afflicted with such consistency? Why do those who practice these techniques become more loving, more compassionate, more devoted to serving others? Why does it lead practitioners toward the very virtues that Christ himself taught? And if it is divine, why was such wisdom not revealed to humanity through the gospel alone? I fear, Your Majesty, that we have encountered a mystery that our faith has no comfortable way to contain. Constantine's solution would establish a pattern that the Vatican would follow for the next 17 centuries. Preserve the texts in absolute secrecy, study their contents exhaustively, and quietly incorporate their most beneficial techniques into Christian practice while maintaining public ignorance of their non-Christian origins. It was a policy born of both wisdom and fear. Wisdom that recognized the value of ancient knowledge, and fear that revealing its existence might undermine the Church's claim to exclusive divine revelation. In 325 AD, just 12 years after legalizing Christianity, Constantine convened the famous Council of Nicaea. While historians remember this gathering primarily for its resolution of the Arian controversy and its establishment of the Nicene Creed, the council had another, more secret purpose: the formation of a commission tasked with examining all texts that might challenge fundamental Christian doctrines. This commission of examination, as it came to be known in whispered conversations among the bishops, was given an impossible mandate. Determine which non-Christian texts contained genuine spiritual wisdom, which were products of demonic deception, and which were merely human speculation. Their work would continue in absolute secrecy for the next 17 centuries, growing more complex and more troubling with each generation, as new discoveries forced them to confront ever more challenging questions about the nature of divine revelation. The Commission's first major test came with those same 127 Egyptian texts that had so disturbed Bishop Hosius. Working in sealed chambers beneath the Lateran Palace, teams of scholars, theologians, and what we might today call experimental psychologists began the systematic testing of Egyptian techniques under controlled conditions. The results defied every expectation. The Papyrus of Isis Healing described methods for curing blindness through vocal resonance, specific sound frequencies that allegedly dissolved cataracts and repaired damaged retinal tissue. When tested on volunteers from Christian communities around Rome, the techniques proved effective in 7 cases out of 10, with complete restoration of sight achieved in 3 subjects. Yet the procedures required no prayer to Christ, no invocation of Christian saints, no reference to biblical authority whatsoever. The Scroll of Osiris communication contained instructions for what could only be called telepathic contact with the deceased. The text claimed that consciousness survived bodily death and could be contacted through specific meditation techniques combined with the burning of particular incense formulations. When Bishop Macarius of Jerusalem attempted these procedures in a sealed crypt beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, witnesses reported clear communication with departed Christians who provided information that could only have been known to them during their earthly lives. Most unsettling of all was the complete manual of Haker, a text that the Commission's scholars dated to approximately 2600 BC, making it older than any known religious scripture. This document contained what its authors claimed was the full curriculum taught to Egyptian initiates over a lifetime of temple training, from basic healing techniques to the ultimate mastery of what they called the divine frequency. The manual described human consciousness not as a product of physical brain activity, but as a localized expression of cosmic intelligence, what modern quantum physicists might call a standing wave in the quantum field of awareness that permeates all space and time. It taught that this consciousness could be expanded, refined, and ultimately liberated from all material limitations through systematic training in meditation, energy manipulation, and what the text calls frequency alignment with the source. When Cardinal Bessarion attempted to follow the manual's instructions in 326 AD, the results shattered his understanding of human potential. Within 3 months of beginning the practices, he developed the ability to heal minor ailments through touch alone. Within 6 months, he could perceive the health conditions of individuals simply by observing their energy patterns. Within a year, he was experiencing direct communication with what he described as angelic intelligences that provided guidance on matters of theology, healing, and spiritual development. His private journal, discovered in the Vatican archives in 1823 and immediately resealed, contains this remarkable passage: "I have learned that what we call miracles are simply the natural expression of consciousness operating at frequencies we have forgotten how to access." The Egyptian priests were not magicians. They were scientists of the spirit, researchers into the true nature of human divine potential. Every mystical experience recorded by our Christian saints, every miracle attributed to divine intervention, every direct revelation received by our most holy fathers, all of these are described in methodical detail in the Egyptian texts, with step-by-step instructions for producing them reliably. As reports of these experiments spread among commission members, a terrible realization began to dawn. Christianity might not represent humanity's first encounter with divine revelation. The Egyptians appeared to have developed a complete spiritual science thousands of years before Christ's incarnation, a systematic method for developing human consciousness to divine levels that was methodical, repeatable, and extraordinarily effective. This knowledge began to permeate the church in subtle but profound ways. Christian contemplative techniques quietly incorporated Egyptian meditation methods. Monastic communities developed healing practices based on sound frequencies described in the ancient papyri. Seminary training began to include courses in what was euphemistically called pastoral counseling, but actually involved techniques for reading human energy patterns and providing spiritual guidance based on direct intuitive perception. Yet even as the church benefited from this ancient wisdom, its leaders grappled with questions that struck at the very heart of Christian identity. If the Egyptians possessed genuine divine knowledge long before Christ's incarnation, what did that say about the uniqueness of Christian revelation? If human beings could learn to perform miracles through systematic training rather than divine grace alone, what happened to the doctrine of humanity's fundamental separation from God? Most troubling of all was the implication that such abilities might be the natural birthright of human consciousness, that every person possessed, dormant within their awareness, the same divine potential that Christ had demonstrated so perfectly. If this were true, then the Church's role as exclusive mediator between God and humanity would face its greatest challenge since the days of the Apostles. The stage was now set for a secret struggle that would span centuries, a hidden conflict between institutional Christianity and ancient wisdom that promised to transform every human being into their own priest, their own healer, their own direct conduit to divine intelligence. The Commission of Examination had opened a door that could never be fully closed, and through that opening whispered questions that would forever change how the Church understood its mission in the world. In the depths of the Vatican, candles burn beside manuscripts that contain the power to revolutionize human understanding of divine potential. And in their flickering light, hieroglyphs dance with secrets that promise to reveal the greatest mystery of all: that the kingdom of heaven Christ proclaimed might not be a distant paradise reserved for the afterlife, but a state of consciousness available to any human being willing to undertake the systematic training that Egyptian priests had perfected millennia before the birth of Christianity. But such revelations, the Commission would discover, could not remain confined to scholarly examination. As word of these discoveries began to spread through subtle channels within the church hierarchy, ambitious clerics and mystically inclined monks would begin to seek out this forbidden knowledge for themselves, setting the stage for the secret infiltration of Egyptian wisdom into the very heart of medieval Christianity. As the centuries passed, and the Commission of Examination's work spread through whispered conversations in monastery corridors and sealed letters between bishops, the forbidden knowledge of Egypt began to seep into the church like water finding cracks in stone. What started as scholarly curiosity among a handful of Vatican insiders gradually evolved into something far more dangerous, a secret network of clerics who had tasted the power of ancient wisdom and could never return to simple faith alone. The first to fall, though he would never have described it as falling, was a brilliant young scholar named Albertus Magnus, later known to history as St. Albert the Great. Born in Bavaria around 1200 AD, Albert possessed the kind of mind that appears perhaps once in a generation. Insatiably curious, methodically precise, and gifted with the rare ability to see connections that eluded others. When he arrived at the University of Paris in 1245 to study theology, he carried with him a secret that would transform his understanding of divine power forever. Picture Albert in his private cell at the Dominican convent, hunched over manuscripts by the light of beeswax candles that burn with unusual steadiness. The year is 1250, and spread before him are papyrus fragments that officially do not exist, pages from the Commission's Egyptian collection, copied by hand in the deepest secrecy and passed through a chain of trusted scholars like contraband more precious than gold. These are not complete texts, but carefully selected excerpts, formulas for transmuting base metals into noble ones, instructions for creating what the Egyptians called philosophical mercury, and most intriguingly, detailed descriptions of processes that operate through what the ancient texts call the marriage of solar and lunar principles. To the casual observer, they might appear to be primitive attempts at chemistry, but Albert's trained eye recognizes something far more sophisticated, a systematic approach to manipulating matter through consciousness that predates Aristotelian natural philosophy by 2 millennia. Working in absolute secrecy, Albert begins to test these ancient formulations. In a hidden laboratory beneath the Dominican house, using equipment crafted according to Egyptian specifications found in the papyri, he discovers that the texts are not symbolic allegories, but precise technical instructions. When he follows the procedures exactly, maintaining specific temperatures, timing operations according to lunar phases, and most importantly, holding particular states of consciousness during each phase of the work, the results defy every assumption about the nature of matter itself. His private journal, written in a cipher of his own devising, records the moment when lead first transformed before his eyes. The solar fire descends into the lunar substance, and what was base becomes noble through the marriage of opposites. This is not magic as the ignorant understand it, but the application of laws that govern all creation. The Egyptians knew what we have forgotten, that matter responds to consciousness, that thought directed with sufficient precision and power can reshape the very foundations of physical reality. But Albert's experiments extend far beyond metallic transmutation. Following Egyptian medical texts that describe the human body as a microcosm of cosmic principles, he develops healing techniques that his contemporaries attribute to miraculous intervention. His ability to diagnose illnesses through direct observation, to prescribe herbal remedies with uncanny accuracy, and to heal conditions that baffle other physicians becomes legendary throughout medieval Europe. What his admirers do not know is that Albert's methods are based entirely on Egyptian papyri that describe the human energy system in detail that won't be matched by Western medicine for another 7 centuries. The texts map what they call the Ka body, a subtle energy field that surrounds and interpenetrates physical tissue, carrying information about health, emotion, and spiritual development that can be read by trained practitioners like text on a page. Following Egyptian instructions, Albert learns to perceive these energy patterns through systematic meditation practices that expand his sensory capabilities beyond normal human limits. He develops the ability to diagnose illness by observing disruptions in what the Egyptians called the rainbow body, to prescribe treatments that address energetic imbalances rather than just physical symptoms, and most remarkably, to facilitate healing by directing what the ancient texts describe as the creative fire through his own consciousness into the patient's energy system. His student, Thomas Aquinas, who will later become one of Christianity's greatest theologians, witnesses these healings repeatedly, but never learns their true source. In his own writings, Thomas attributes Albert's abilities to gifts of the Holy Spirit and divine illumination, never suspecting that his beloved teacher is applying techniques perfected in the temples of ancient Egypt. But Albert is not alone in his secret studies. 2 centuries earlier, another figure had begun walking the dangerous path between Egyptian wisdom and Christian orthodoxy, a man who would become one of the most controversial popes in history, precisely because of his rumored connections to forbidden knowledge. Gerbert of Aurillac, who reigned as Pope Sylvester II from 9999 to 1003 AD, was accused by his enemies of learning mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy through demonic pacts. The truth, locked away in Vatican archives that few have ever seen, was both more mundane and more extraordinary. Sylvester had gained access to Egyptian mathematical texts through contacts in Muslim Spain, and had used their advanced knowledge to revolutionize European understanding of numbers, calculation, and the celestial sciences. The Arabic numerals that Sylvester introduced to Europe, the very numbers we use today, were themselves based on Egyptian mathematical systems that the Commission's scholars had been secretly studying for centuries. When Sylvester demonstrated mechanical clocks, optical instruments, and calculating devices that seemed impossibly advanced for his era, critics whispered of supernatural assistance. They were wrong about the supernatural, but right about the assistance. Sylvester was applying engineering principles described in Egyptian texts that treated mathematics not as abstract theory, but as applied consciousness technology. His private correspondence, preserved in cipher and hidden within seemingly innocent theological treatises, reveals the extent of his secret knowledge. The ancients knew that number is the language through which divine intelligence speaks creation into existence. Through understanding numerical principles, not as mere quantities, but as expressions of cosmic harmony, the human mind can participate directly in the creative process. What we call miracles are simply applications of mathematical laws that govern the interaction between consciousness and matter. Sylvester's reign was marked by an unprecedented flowering of intellectual achievement that his contemporaries attributed to divine blessing on the papal office. Universities began to develop programs in natural philosophy. Monasteries established scriptoriums that preserved and copied Greek and Arabic texts. The foundations were laid for what historians would later call the medieval Renaissance. What those historians did not know was that this intellectual awakening was fueled by Egyptian knowledge, carefully disseminated through secret networks within the church itself. Benedictine monasteries, in particular, became hidden repositories of ancient wisdom, their libraries containing carefully disguised translations of Egyptian medical, astronomical, and philosophical texts, alongside traditional Christian manuscripts. The monastery of Monte Cassino developed a medical school whose healing techniques were remarkably advanced for their time. The Abbey of Saint-Denis pioneered architectural innovations that incorporated Egyptian principles of sacred geometry. The monastery at Cluny established scriptoriums that preserved texts in languages most Christians had never heard of, copied by monks who worked in secret chambers accessible only to the most trusted initiates. This monastic network operated with extraordinary discretion for centuries, sharing knowledge through coded letters, traveling scholars who carried messages disguised as theological discussions, and carefully planned exchanges of manuscripts that appeared to be routine interlibrary loans. To the outside world, these were simply devout religious communities dedicated to prayer, study, and service. In reality, they formed the backbone of a secret educational system that preserved and developed Egyptian wisdom within the protective embrace of Christian monasticism. The true extent of this network became apparent during one of the most devastating crises in European history, the Black Death pandemic that swept across the continent beginning in 1347. As traditional medicine proved helpless against the plague's ravages, desperate people turned to any source of healing they could find, including techniques that officially did not exist. In Florence, as bodies piled in the streets and traditional physicians fled the city in terror, a Franciscan monk named Brother Alessandro appeared at the doors of Santa Maria Novella, carrying nothing but a leather satchel filled with what appeared to be common herbs and a small papyrus scroll covered with symbols that no one recognized. What followed would become legend among those few who witnessed it, and a closely guarded secret among those who understood its true significance. Working with methodical precision that suggested extensive training, Brother Alessandro began treating plague victims using techniques that defied every principle of medieval medicine. Instead of bleeding patients or attempting to balance their humors, he administered herbal preparations while intoning specific sounds, not Latin prayers, but mathematical frequencies that seemed to resonate in the very air around the sick. Most remarkably, he required plague victims to be positioned in specific geometric patterns within the treatment area, their bodies aligned according to what he called the lines of life force that flowed through the earth itself. To observers, these arrangements looked like elaborate ritual circles. In reality, they were precise applications of Egyptian knowledge about how human energy fields interact with planetary magnetic currents. The results were unprecedented in the history of European medicine. Of the more than 200 plague victims that Brother Alessandro treated using these techniques, fewer than 30 died, a survival rate of nearly 90% in a pandemic that was killing 9 out of every 10 people it infected. Word of these miraculous recoveries spread throughout Italy, despite Alessandro's attempts to work in secrecy. When church authorities finally questioned him about his methods, Brother Alessandro revealed a secret that sent shockwaves through the highest levels of Vatican administration. He had been trained in these techniques at a monastery in the Pyrenees, where selected Franciscan monks had been learning what their superiors called alternative spiritual sciences for more than 50 years. The investigation that followed uncovered a network of training centers that spanned Europe, all connected to the original commission of examination and all dedicated to the practical application of Egyptian wisdom within Christian contexts. At the monastery of Saint-Denis near Paris, monks had been developing healing techniques based on sound frequency for decades. At Monte Cassino, a secret scriptorium had been producing medical texts that combined Egyptian formulas with Christian prayers. At Cluny, select scholars had been studying Egyptian astronomical texts to develop more accurate calendars and navigation methods. The Vatican faced an unprecedented crisis. The very techniques that were saving lives during the plague outbreak were based on knowledge that the Church had officially condemned as demonic. Yet the results were undeniably beneficial. Brother Alessandro's patients recovered from plague, while those treated by traditional methods died in agony. How could the Church condemn as evil something that healed the sick and comforted the dying more effectively than any approved medical practice? The solution that emerged from months of secret deliberation among the highest church officials established a pattern that would define Vatican policy for the next 2 centuries: the creation of an official body dedicated to investigating and controlling dangerous knowledge while simultaneously exploiting its practical benefits. In 1542, Pope Paul III established the Sacred Congregation of the Roman and Universal Inquisition, known today as the Congregatio Pro Doctrina Fidei. While history remembers this institution primarily for its role in combating Protestant heresy, its secret mandate was far broader: to monitor, control, and when necessary, eliminate any knowledge that threatened church authority, while ensuring that the most useful aspects of such knowledge remained available to trusted church officials. The congregation's secret protocols, preserved in archives that remain sealed to this day, reveal the extraordinary complexity of the Vatican's relationship with Egyptian wisdom. Teams of scholar inquisitors were tasked with identifying individuals who possessed forbidden knowledge, determining the sources and extent of their learning, and either recruiting them into church service or eliminating the threat they posed. Simultaneously, Other teams worked to develop sanitized versions of Egyptian techniques that could be taught to priests and missionaries as gifts of the Holy Spirit, or advanced forms of Christian contemplation. The result was a remarkable paradox that would define the Counter-Reformation. The same church that burned heretics for possessing forbidden books was secretly training its own scholars in the very knowledge it publicly condemned. Jesuit colleges developed curricula that included meditation techniques derived from Egyptian mystery schools. Seminary courses in pastoral theology incorporated methods for reading human energy patterns and providing spiritual guidance based on direct intuitive perception. Even the famous spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola, founder of the Jesuit order, contained elements clearly derived from Egyptian consciousness training practices. This systematic infiltration of Egyptian wisdom into Christian practice produced a generation of clergy whose abilities seemed almost supernatural to their contemporaries. Jesuit missionaries in the New World demonstrated healing powers that convinced indigenous populations of Christianity's superiority. Papal nuncios, negotiating with Protestant leaders, possessed uncanny abilities to read the intentions and emotional states of their opponents. Seminary-trained priests developed reputations for miraculous healing that drew pilgrims from across Europe. What the faithful did not realize was that these apparent miracles were the systematic application of techniques perfected in Egyptian temples millennia before Christ's birth, now clothed in Christian terminology and attributed to divine grace rather than human knowledge. But such secrets, however carefully guarded, could not remain hidden forever. By the mid-15th century, reports began to surface of phenomena that even the Church's most experienced inquisitors found difficult to explain or control. The monastery of Saint Vincent in the Vosges Mountains reported that monks practicing advanced contemplative techniques had begun experiencing visions of beings that bore little resemblance to traditional Christian angels or saints. These entities, described in confidential reports as beings of pure light, clothed in forms that hurt the mind to perceive, appeared during meditation sessions based on Egyptian consciousness expansion techniques. Unlike the gentle, reassuring presences described in conventional Christian mystical literature, these beings radiated power so intense that several monks required medical treatment for what modern psychology would recognize as severe anxiety disorders. Father Benedict Montcroix, the monastery's spiritual director, wrote in his encrypted journal, "We have opened doorways that perhaps were meant to remain closed. The entities that respond to the ancient Egyptian invocations possess knowledge that transcends human understanding, but they demand a price for their wisdom that threatens the very foundations of Christian faith. They speak of divine truths that existed before Christ's incarnation, of spiritual laws that operate independent of church sacraments, of human potential that makes our doctrine of salvation through grace alone seem like a comforting lie told to children." The most disturbing incident occurred at the Dominican house in Prague in 1456, when a group of monks attempting to contact their deceased founder using Egyptian necromantic techniques succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. The entity that manifested in their circle bore the appearance of Saint Dominic himself, but spoke words that chilled the blood of every monk present. According to the confidential report filed with the congregation, this apparition claimed that death was merely a transition between states of consciousness, that communication between the living and dead was a natural ability that any human could develop through proper training, and most disturbing of all, that the Christian concept of eternal damnation was a misunderstanding of spiritual laws that actually governed reincarnation and karmic evolution. "We fled the room in terror," wrote Brother Johannes, the only monk willing to record the experience. Not because the entity was evil, but because its words carried the ring of absolute truth. If the dead can be contacted so easily, if consciousness survives bodily death without need of divine judgment, if human beings can develop godlike abilities through systematic training rather than divine grace alone, then what becomes of our entire theological system? What need is there for church, sacrament, or salvation, if every soul carries within itself the seed of divinity? The investigation that followed this incident led to the most comprehensive review of Egyptian infiltration in church history. Secret tribunals were convened to examine every monastery, seminary, and religious house suspected of harboring forbidden knowledge. The results were sobering. Egyptian wisdom had penetrated Christian practice so thoroughly that it had become virtually impossible to separate orthodox doctrine from ancient techniques. The Church's response established policies that remain in effect to this day. Rather than attempting to eliminate Egyptian influence entirely, Vatican authorities chose to manage and control it through layers of secrecy and misdirection. The most dangerous knowledge was confined to the highest levels of church hierarchy, while sanitized versions of practical techniques were gradually introduced into mainstream Christian practice under the guise of spiritual development and theological scholarship. This carefully managed infiltration would set the stage for some of the most remarkable episodes in church history, as Renaissance popes began to openly patronize scholars who studied ancient wisdom, while simultaneously maintaining the public fiction that such knowledge was either non-existent or demonic. The contradictions inherent in this policy would eventually force the Vatican to develop even more sophisticated methods of controlling information, methods that would be tested to their limits as the age of printing made the widespread distribution of forbidden knowledge increasingly difficult to prevent. In the shadows of medieval monasteries, candles still burn beside manuscripts that contain secrets powerful enough to transform human understanding of divine potential. And in their flickering light, questions whisper that will soon explode into the broader world. If ancient Egyptians possessed spiritual technologies that surpass anything in Christian tradition, what happens when that knowledge escapes the control of those who have guarded it for centuries? The answer would come with the Renaissance, when the careful balance between secrecy and scholarship would finally collapse under the weight of human curiosity and the revolutionary power of the printing press. Rome, February 17th, 1600. In St. Peter's Square, flames leap toward the winter sky as Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, the Catholic Church's most feared defender of orthodoxy, watches another pile of forbidden books feed the Inquisition's fire. The crowd cheers as manuscripts on astrology, alchemy, and natural magic crackle and dissolve into ash, their dangerous knowledge apparently consigned to oblivion forever. What the faithful gathering in the square cannot see, what they are never meant to see, is the remarkable theatre being performed for their benefit. For even as these public pyres consume their offerings of condemned texts, 3 stories beneath the Vatican Palace, an entirely different scene unfolds in chambers that appear on no architectural plans. Picture Brother Marcus, hunched over a copying desk in a vault lit by specially designed oil lamps that burn without smoke or odor. His skilled hands move across fresh parchment with the precision of a master scribe, carefully reproducing every symbol, every diagram, every word of the very same texts that are turning to ash in the square above his head. The irony is exquisite and intentional. While Rome celebrates the destruction of heretical knowledge, the Vatican's most secret scribes work through the night to ensure that not a single dangerous idea is actually lost. This elaborate deception represents the culmination of a policy that began forming in the late 15th century, as the printing press made the control of information increasingly difficult, and the Protestant Reformation forced the Catholic Church to publicly demonstrate its commitment to doctrinal purity. The solution, developed through decades of careful planning by the Church's most sophisticated minds, was breathtaking in its audacity. Create a public spectacle of destroying forbidden knowledge while secretly preserving every word for continued study and application. The mechanism for this deception was the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books established by Pope Paul IV in 1559. To the outside world, the index represented the Church's definitive catalogue of texts too dangerous for Christian minds to encounter. Books that appeared on the index were banned from publication, possession, or distribution throughout Catholic territories. Those found reading them faced excommunication or worse. But within the deepest archives of the Vatican, a parallel document existed that told a very different story. Known only as the Codex Reservatus, the reserved code, this secret catalogue identified the same forbidden texts not as works to be destroyed, but as materials to be preserved, studied, and when appropriate, quietly applied by authorized church officials. The genius of this system lay in its psychological impact on both the faithful and the Church's own personnel. Catholics throughout Europe genuinely believed that the Vatican had purged itself of dangerous knowledge, making Church authority appear more trustworthy and doctrinally pure. Simultaneously, most clergy remained ignorant of the secret preservation program, allowing them to condemn forbidden practices with sincere conviction, while unknowingly benefiting from techniques derived from those same condemned sources. Only a select circle of cardinals, scholars, and specially trained operatives knew the truth, that beneath the Vatican's public face of rigid orthodoxy lay the most sophisticated intelligence operation in European history, dedicated to acquiring, preserving, and exploiting every form of useful knowledge, regardless of its origins or theological implications. The scope of this operation becomes clear when examining the case of Giordano Bruno, the Dominican friar whose execution in 1600 has become a symbol of Church intolerance towards scientific innovation. The standard historical narrative presents Bruno as a martyr to astronomical truth, burned at the stake for supporting Copernican heliocentrism against Church dogma. The reality, preserved in documents that few historians have ever seen, is far more complex and disturbing. Bruno was indeed executed, but not primarily for his astronomical theories, which the Church was already quietly studying through Jesuit scholars who maintained correspondence with Protestant astronomers throughout Europe. Bruno's real crime was threatening to reveal the extent of Egyptian infiltration within Catholic doctrine, something he had discovered during his own secret studies of ancient wisdom traditions. In his private notebooks, seized after his arrest and never made public, Bruno had documented connections between Christian sacraments and Egyptian magical practices that were so specific and detailed that they could only have come from someone with access to the Vatican's most classified archives. His writings described Christian liturgical techniques as shadows of the true Egyptian sciences, and proposed that Catholicism itself was essentially an Egyptianized religion that had forgotten its own origins. Most dangerous of all, Bruno had begun to teach publicly that the same consciousness expansion techniques preserved in Egyptian texts could be found encoded within Christian mystical practices for those who knew how to look. He claimed that the Mass itself was a disguised Egyptian ritual for manipulating what he called cosmic energy, and that properly trained priests could produce genuine miracles by understanding the ancient principles underlying their ceremonial actions. The Vatican's response was swift and brutal, but also remarkably selective. Bruno was publicly executed as a dangerous heretic whose writings threatened the foundations of Christian faith. Yet within months of his death, his private manuscripts were being carefully studied by the same scholars who had condemned him, and his insights into the connections between Egyptian and Christian practices were being incorporated into secret training programs for advanced clergy. This pattern of public condemnation, combined with private exploitation, reached its most sophisticated expression in the work of Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, the brilliant Jesuit theologian who served as the Inquisition's chief architect of Orthodox doctrine during some of its most active years. To the outside world, Bellarmine appeared as the perfect embodiment of counter-Reformation zeal, a scholar of impeccable reputation who had dedicated his life to defending Catholic truth against Protestant error and pagan contamination. His public writings present a man of absolute theological certainty, one who viewed any deviation from established church teaching as a direct assault on Christian salvation itself. His treatises on papal authority, his condemnations of Protestant theology, and his participation in heresy trials established him as one of the most formidable defenders of Catholic orthodoxy in church history. Yet Bellarmine's private library, catalogued after his death in a document that was immediately classified and sealed, told a very different story. Among his personal possessions were 47 manuscripts dealing with Egyptian magic, alchemy, astrology, and what his private notes called the ancient sciences of consciousness transformation. These were not texts acquired for the purpose of refutation or condemnation. Bellarmine's marginal notes, written in a cipher of his own devising, revealed deep study, careful experimentation, and systematic application of the very knowledge he publicly denounced. His secret journal, discovered in 1823 during renovations of the cardinal's former residence and immediately transferred to the Vatican's most restricted archives, contains passages that would have scandalized Catholic Europe if they had become public. To defeat the serpent of heretical knowledge, one must understand its wisdom better than those who follow it. I have found that the ancient Egyptian techniques for expanding human consciousness produce effects that surpass anything achievable through conventional prayer or contemplation. The question that haunts my meditations is not whether this knowledge is effective, its results speak for themselves, but whether its effectiveness proves its divine origin or reveals our ignorance of how divine power actually operates in the world. Bellamine's journals reveal that he had developed abilities that his contemporaries would have considered miraculous. The capacity to read the thoughts and intentions of those who appeared before Inquisition tribunals, the power to heal minor ailments through the laying on of hands, and most remarkably, the gift of what he called prophetic sight, the ability to perceive probable future outcomes with sufficient accuracy to guide major church policy decisions. These abilities, achieved through systematic application of Egyptian consciousness training techniques, while maintaining his public role as their most vocal opponent, made Bellarmine perhaps the most effective inquisitor in church history. His uncanny ability to identify actual threats to church authority while ignoring harmless eccentrics, his skill at predicting which theological controversies would develop into serious challenges and which would fade naturally, and his talent for crafting responses that neutralized dangerous ideas without creating martyrs, all stemmed from capabilities that he had developed through the very practices he publicly condemned. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain such a double life would have shattered a weaker mind, but Bellarmine possessed the intellectual sophistication to construct a theological framework that justified his secret studies. In his private writings, he developed what he called the doctrine of comprehensive knowledge, arguing that church authorities had not just the right, but the obligation to master any form of understanding that could be used to protect Christian souls from deception. The surgeon must understand disease better than the patient, he wrote, and the shepherd must know the ways of wolves better than the sheep. If Egyptian techniques can expand human consciousness beyond normal limits, then those charged with guiding souls toward God must develop such consciousness themselves, lest they be deceived by enemies who possess capabilities that exceed their own understanding. This rationalization allowed Bellarmine and others like him to pursue forbidden knowledge with clear consciences, viewing their secret studies not as betrayals of Christian faith, but as its highest expression. They saw themselves as spiritual warriors who ventured into dangerous territories of knowledge for the protection of those too innocent or too weak to defend themselves against sophisticated forms of deception. The broader implications of this systematic hypocrisy extended far beyond individual careers or personal contradictions. By the early 17th century, the Catholic Church had developed into something unprecedented in human history, an institution that publicly promoted one understanding of reality while secretly operating according to entirely different principles. Catholic universities taught Aristotelian physics, while Jesuit scholars privately studied Copernican astronomy. Seminary curricula emphasized salvation through grace alone, while select students learned Egyptian techniques for achieving mystical union with divine intelligence. Missionary colleges prepared priests to convert pagans from their primitive superstitions, while simultaneously training them in meditation practices derived from those same traditions. This extraordinary duplicity required unprecedented levels of organization and security. The Vatican developed elaborate systems of compartmentalization that kept different aspects of forbidden knowledge separated from each other and from those not authorized to possess them. Scholars working on astronomical calculations were kept ignorant of colleagues studying alchemical formulations. Priests learning advanced healing techniques remained unaware of others being trained in what amounted to consciousness-based espionage methods. Communication between different aspects of these programs occurred through layers of intermediaries and coded documents that obscured the true scope of activities even from many of their participants. A cardinal might authorize funding for advanced theological research without knowing that the money was being used to establish laboratories where Egyptian alchemical techniques were being systematically tested and refined. The printing press, which had initially threatened to make this whole system impossible by democratizing access to information, was gradually turned into an instrument of control and misdirection. The Church established its own printing houses that specialized in producing carefully edited versions of potentially dangerous texts, versions that contained enough genuine material to satisfy scholars while omitting the most practically useful information. Simultaneously, Church-sponsored publishers flooded European markets with books that presented simplified or deliberately distorted accounts of topics like alchemy, astrology, and natural magic. These publications served a double purpose. They satisfied public curiosity about forbidden subjects, while ensuring that anyone attempting to apply the techniques described would achieve only limited or no results. The most sophisticated example of this strategy involved the deliberate promotion of what modern scholars would recognize as disinformation about ancient Egyptian religion and philosophy. Church-sponsored historians and archaeologists published works that portrayed Egyptian civilization as primitive, superstitious, and obsessed with death, a characterization that persists in popular culture to this day, despite overwhelming archaeological evidence to the contrary. This distorted image served Vatican interests perfectly by making it seem impossible that ancient Egyptians could have possessed advanced knowledge worth preserving or studying. If Egyptian civilization was truly as backward as Church scholars claimed, then obviously any similarities between Egyptian practices and Christian techniques must represent Christian improvement of primitive pagan fumbling, rather than preservation of sophisticated ancient wisdom. The irony is breathtaking when viewed from the perspective of modern knowledge about Egyptian civilization. While Church propagandists portrayed ancient Egypt as a culture obsessed with death and superstition, Vatican scholars were secretly studying Egyptian texts that described mathematical principles not rediscovered by European science until the 19th century, medical techniques that surpassed contemporary practice by centuries, and consciousness training methods that produced results unmatched by any other tradition they had encountered. Yet this campaign of disinformation was so successful that it shaped not just popular understanding, but scholarly opinion for centuries to come. Even today, most people think of ancient Egypt primarily in terms of pyramids, mummies, and death cults, remaining completely unaware of the sophisticated knowledge systems that Vatican scholars have been secretly studying and applying for more than a millennium. The scope of this deception becomes even more remarkable when considered in light of modern popular culture's fascination with Vatican conspiracy theories. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code captured public imagination with its portrayal of church authorities hiding secrets about Jesus' historical identity and the true nature of Christian origins. But Brown barely scratched the surface of the actual conspiracy that has been operating for centuries within Vatican walls. The real conspiracy isn't about Jesus' bloodline or the location of the Holy Grail. It's about knowledge that could fundamentally transform human understanding of consciousness, reality, and the divine potential that lies dormant within every human being. While millions of readers thrill to fictional accounts of church secrets, the actual Vatican archives contain documents that would revolutionize science, medicine, psychology, and spirituality if their contents were ever made public. The tragedy is that this knowledge, which could alleviate enormous amounts of human suffering and accelerate spiritual development beyond anything currently imagined possible, remains locked away, not because it is evil or dangerous, but because its revelation would undermine institutional structures that have become more important to their guardians than the welfare of humanity itself. By the mid-17th century, the Vatican's system of public orthodoxy, combined with secret experimentation, had achieved a stability that seemed capable of lasting indefinitely. The Church had successfully navigated the challenges posed by the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the printing press, while maintaining both its public authority and its private access to forbidden knowledge. Yet this apparent success contained the seeds of future crisis. Each generation of church leaders who inherited this system of organized deception faced the psychological challenge of reconciling their public commitments with their private knowledge. Some, like Bellarmine, managed this through sophisticated theological rationalization. Others, began to question whether an institution built on such fundamental dishonesty could truly serve divine purposes. Moreover, the very success of Vatican preservation efforts meant that dangerous knowledge was accumulating in ever greater quantities within church archives. What had begun as a few dozen Egyptian scrolls had grown into a vast library of texts, experiments, and discoveries that represented the most advanced understanding of consciousness and reality anywhere in the European world. The question that would increasingly haunt church leaders was not whether they could continue to keep these secrets hidden, but whether they had the moral right to do so. The stage was being set for the next phase of this extraordinary saga, the period when Vatican scholars would be forced to grapple not just with the practical applications of ancient wisdom, but with the profound ethical implications of hoarding knowledge that could transform human civilization, while billions of souls remained ignorant of their true divine potential. In the depths of Vatican archives, candles continue to burn beside manuscripts that contain the power to reshape human understanding of reality itself. And in those archives, future generations of church leaders will face the question that has haunted every generation since Constantine. What happens when the guardians of divine truth discover that the truth they guard might be too magnificent for any single institution to contain? Beneath Vatican City, deeper than the famous catacombs, deeper even than the foundations laid by Constantine's architects, lies a realm that exists on no official map and appears in no tourist guidebook. To reach it, you must descend through levels of security that make Fort Knox seem casually protected, past Swiss guards who have sworn oaths that bind them beyond death, through corridors where even the Pope himself requires special authorization to tread. The famous 53 miles of shelving in the Vatican's secret archives that scholars occasionally glimpse represents merely the visible tip of an intellectual iceberg whose true dimensions would stagger the imagination. For every mile of manuscript storage that appears in official inventories, 3 more miles of far more sensitive material rest in chambers, whose existence is known only to a handful of the Church's most trusted custodians. Section R7, Level 3. Even the designation sounds like something from a science fiction novel, yet it represents one of the most carefully guarded repositories of human knowledge anywhere on Earth. Here, behind walls within walls, protected by security systems that combine medieval secrecy with 21st century technology, sits the Egypticus collection, the Vatican's complete archive of Egyptian wisdom accumulated over 17 centuries of secret acquisition and preservation. The first thing that strikes any visitor authorized to enter these forbidden chambers, and in the past decade, fewer than 3 scholars have received such authorization, is the environmental control system. The air itself feels different here, processed through filters that remove not just dust and moisture, but even trace amounts of acids that might damage ancient materials over centuries of storage. The temperature never varies by more than 1/10 of a degree from exactly 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity remains constant at precisely 45%, maintained by systems so sophisticated that they respond to changes caused by a single person's breathing patterns. These conditions have been maintained without interruption since 1623, when Pope Urban VIII ordered the construction of what he called in his private correspondence, chambers worthy of preserving wisdom that predates the flood itself. The engineering required to achieve such precision using 17th century technology bordered on the impossible. Yet somehow Vatican architects succeeded in creating an environment that has preserved papyrus fragments for 400 years with less deterioration than most museums achieve over 4 decades. The collection itself defies easy description. As of the last complete inventory conducted in 1981, an undertaking that required 6 months and involved scholars who were subsequently transferred to remote assignments where they had no contact with the outside world, the Egypticus collection contained exactly 1,247 catalogued items. But these numbers tell only part of the story, for individual items often consist of multiple scrolls, codices, or manuscript fragments that could easily constitute separate works in any other archive. Papyrus 127A, for example, appears in the catalogue as a single entry, but actually consists of 14 separate scrolls that together comprise what may be the most complete Egyptian magical curriculum ever assembled. The texts range from basic instructions for perceiving human energy fields to advanced techniques for what the ancient scribes called walking between the worlds, methods for maintaining conscious awareness during the transition from physical life to whatever lies beyond death. Codex 89b contains mathematical formulations that wouldn't look out of place in a modern physics laboratory, describing the universe in terms of vibrational frequencies and geometric relationships that European science wouldn't rediscover until the 20th century. The margins of this text bear notes in the handwriting of Galileo himself, copied during a secret visit to the Vatican archives in 1632. The same year, the Church publicly condemned his astronomical theories, while privately seeking his opinion on ancient Egyptian descriptions of celestial mechanics. The most heavily restricted portion of the collection occupies a separate chamber whose access is controlled by protocols that seem almost surreal in their complexity. According to documents leaked by a Vatican insider in 1978, documents that were immediately denounced as fabrications despite their eerily accurate descriptions of archive security procedures, this inner sanctum requires authorization from no fewer than 7 different church officials, including the Pope himself, the Cardinal Secretary of State, and the Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The leaked memo, which Vatican authorities neither confirmed nor denied, described texts containing what the anonymous author called pre-flood wisdom, knowledge that supposedly predated the biblical deluge and preserved techniques for human consciousness development that were old when the pyramids were young. According to this document, some papyri in the collection had been subjected to carbon dating analysis that yielded dates of 3100 BC or earlier, making them contemporaneous with the very beginnings of recorded history. The memo also referenced something called Project Thoth, an ongoing translation effort that has supposedly been operating in secret for more than 4 centuries, dedicated to deciphering the most cryptic and powerful texts in the Vatican's possession. Named after the Egyptian god of wisdom and writing, this project allegedly involves teams of scholars working in complete isolation from each other, each translating different sections of the same documents to prevent any single individual from gaining access to complete formulations that might prove too dangerous for uncontrolled knowledge. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI, provided perhaps the most tantalizing glimpse into the true nature of these archives during a private conversation with a trusted colleague in 1985. According to notes from that conversation, recently discovered among papers donated to a German theological library, Ratzinger made a remarkable admission. There exists one chamber in the deepest levels of our archives that even we dare not enter. The knowledge contained there is so profound, so potentially transformative, that we fear what it might require of us if we truly understood its implications. When pressed for details by his colleague, Ratzinger reportedly continued, "The ancient Egyptians possessed understanding of consciousness and reality that makes our modern science seem like child's play with wooden blocks. But with such knowledge comes responsibility that no human institution may be prepared to bear. If we truly applied what those texts contain, we would be obligated to share capabilities that could transform every human being into something approaching the divine." The question that haunts my prayers is whether we have the right to withhold such knowledge, and whether we would have the wisdom to guide humanity's evolution if we chose to reveal it. These extraordinary claims find support in fragmentary evidence that has surfaced over the decades from various sources within the Vatican hierarchy. Letters between church officials occasionally reference techniques or discoveries that seem to originate from non-Christian sources, yet produce effects that surpass anything achievable through conventional religious practice. Medical reports describe healings performed by Vatican physicians that rely on methods not taught in any European medical school. Diplomatic correspondence hints at information-gathering capabilities that suggest church negotiators possess means of understanding their counterparts' intentions that go far beyond normal observation and deduction. The scope of Project Thoth, if it truly exists as described in the leaked documents, represents one of the most ambitious intellectual undertakings in human history. According to the anonymous memo, The project has operated continuously since 1584, when Pope Gregory III established what he called in encrypted correspondence, a commission for the understanding of pre-Christian wisdom. The project supposedly involves not just translation of Egyptian texts, but systematic testing of the techniques they describe, careful documentation of results, and gradual integration of successful methods into church practice under the guise of spiritual development and theological scholarship. The organizational structure described in the leaked memo reads like something from a spy novel. Translators working on different aspects of the same documents are housed in separate locations and forbidden to communicate with each other. Experimental teams testing Egyptian techniques are told they are participating in research on advanced contemplative practices without being informed of the text's true origins. Even the project's directors supposedly know only their specific area of responsibility, with coordination handled by a small group of cardinals who report directly to the Pope. This compartmentalization serves multiple purposes beyond simple security. It protects individual researchers from the psychological stress of grappling with knowledge that challenges fundamental assumptions about reality and human potential. It prevents the accumulation of complete information in any single location where it might be vulnerable to theft or unauthorized disclosure. Most importantly, it ensures that even if portions of the project were exposed, the full scope of Vatican capabilities and knowledge would remain hidden. The physical layout of the deeper archives reflects this obsession with security and compartmentalization. According to architectural plans that were briefly glimpsed by a construction worker during repairs in 1991, plans that were immediately confiscated and the worker transferred to a monastery where he remains under vows of silence. The underground complex extends at least 7 levels below the Vatican's visible foundations. Each level is accessible only through the level immediately above it, with no direct routes between non-adjacent floors. Individual chambers within each level are connected by corridors that deliberately create maze-like confusion, making it impossible for unauthorized visitors to navigate the complex, even if they somehow gained access. Emergency systems can seal off entire sections by flooding them with an inert gas that preserves documents while making the areas temporarily uninhabitable by humans. The deepest level, designated simply as Omega in the architectural fragments that were observed, allegedly contains only a single chamber whose contents are unknown to all but 3 living individuals: the reigning Pope, the Cardinal Secretary of State, and a mysterious figure identified only as the Keeper, whose identity changes with each papal succession and whose entire existence is devoted to maintaining whatever lies within that ultimate sanctuary. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these archives is not what they contain, but how they are used. According to testimonies from former Vatican insiders who have broken their vows of silence in recent decades, testimonies that the Church neither confirms nor denies, the Egypticus collection is not simply a repository of ancient knowledge, but an active research facility where that knowledge is continuously studied, refined, and applied to contemporary challenges. Teams of church scholars allegedly work in these underground chambers on projects that range from developing more effective methods for spiritual counseling to researching consciousness-based healing techniques that could revolutionize medicine. Some projects supposedly focus on understanding the mechanisms behind mystical experiences reported by saints and visionaries, using Egyptian texts that describe such phenomena in systematic detail that allows for replication under controlled conditions. Other research programs allegedly explore the practical applications of what the Egyptian texts call distance viewing, techniques for gathering information about events occurring in remote locations through purely mental means. According to these accounts, Vatican intelligence operations have been enhanced for centuries by capabilities that would seem supernatural to outside observers, but represent the systematic application of consciousness technologies preserved from ancient Egypt. The implications of such capabilities extend far beyond intelligence gathering or spiritual counseling. If the Vatican truly possesses methods for expanding human consciousness beyond normal limitations, for healing diseases through direct mental intervention, for communicating across vast distances without technological assistance, then the Church has access to technologies that could transform human civilization overnight. The question that haunts anyone who contemplates these possibilities is why such knowledge remains hidden. If Egyptian texts truly contain solutions to humanity's greatest challenges, methods for healing disease, for expanding consciousness, for achieving direct communion with divine intelligence, then what justification exists for keeping such knowledge confined to a small circle of church officials? The leaked Vatican memo from 1978 hints at the reasoning behind this policy of concealment. According to the anonymous author, church leaders fear that releasing such knowledge without proper preparation could lead to catastrophic misuse. Consciousness expansion techniques that could produce enlightenment in prepared individuals might cause psychological breakdown in those lacking adequate spiritual foundation. Healing methods that work through direct mental influence could be perverted into weapons of unprecedented destructiveness. Knowledge of how to communicate with disembodied consciousness might open doorways to realms that humanity is not yet mature enough to explore safely. Yet this protective rationale raises even more troubling questions. Who gave the Vatican the right to make such decisions for all humanity? By what authority do church officials determine humanity's readiness for knowledge that could alleviate enormous suffering and accelerate spiritual development? And most importantly, how can any institution be trusted to guard wisdom that its own members admit they are afraid to fully understand or apply? As the 20th century progressed and the Vatican's secret archives grew ever larger with newly discovered or acquired texts, these ethical dilemmas became increasingly acute. Each new papal administration inherited not just the responsibility of maintaining this vast storehouse of hidden knowledge, but the burden of deciding whether the time had finally come to share at least portions of it with the broader world. The advent of modern technology created additional challenges for the Vatican's traditional secrecy. Carbon dating and other analytical techniques made it increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that ancient wisdom was primitive superstition. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar threatened to reveal the true extent of the Vatican's underground complex. Most importantly, improvements in global communication made it nearly impossible to prevent leaks of sensitive information, as demonstrated by the 1978 memo that provided the world's first detailed glimpse into the archive's true contents. By the end of the 20th century, Vatican leaders faced an unprecedented situation. Their carefully maintained system of secrecy was becoming increasingly unsustainable, yet the knowledge they guarded seemed more relevant and potentially valuable than ever before. Quantum physics was beginning to validate ancient Egyptian descriptions of reality as fundamentally consciousness-based. Medical research was discovering the effectiveness of healing techniques that bore striking resemblances to methods described in Egyptian texts. Even space exploration was revealing astronomical knowledge encoded in Egyptian monuments that shouldn't have been available to ancient civilizations. The stage was being set for the next phase of this extraordinary saga, the period when Vatican authorities would be forced to confront the possibility that their policy of absolute secrecy might itself be preventing humanity from achieving the spiritual evolution that their guardianship was supposedly meant to protect and guide. In the depths beneath Vatican City, surrounded by environmental controls that preserve ancient wisdom more carefully than most museums protect their greatest treasures, candles continue to burn beside texts that could transform human understanding of reality itself. And in those underground chambers, future generations of church leaders will face questions that their predecessors could never have imagined. What happens when the guardians of ancient wisdom discover that the world has evolved to the point where such wisdom might finally be safe to share? And what happens if they discover that withholding it has become a greater sin than revealing it? The Renaissance, with its flowering of art, science, and human potential, would force these questions into the open as never before, as church leaders found themselves simultaneously celebrating human achievement while hiding knowledge that could accelerate that achievement beyond all current imagination. Florence, 1469. In a marble villa overlooking the Arno River, 20-year-old Lorenzo de' Medici receives a visitor whose presence will transform not just his understanding of human potential, but the entire trajectory of what history will remember as the Renaissance. Cardinal Giovanni Tornabuoni, his face drawn with the weight of secrets that have burdened his family for generations, carries with him a leather satchel that contains copies of documents no Christian ruler has seen for centuries. "My lord," the cardinal whispers as Lorenzo dismisses his servants and seals the chamber doors, "what I am about to show you will challenge everything you believe about the nature of human divine potential. The Church has preserved knowledge from ancient Egypt that could elevate humanity to heights that make our greatest philosophers seem like children playing with shadows. What Lorenzo sees in those candlelit hours will reshape European civilization." Spread before him are translations of Egyptian texts that describe human consciousness not as a fixed entity bound by the limitations of mortal flesh, but as a fragment of cosmic intelligence capable of expansion, refinement, and ultimately transcendence of every boundary that seems to constrain human experience. The texts speak of techniques for developing what the Egyptians called the luminous body, a field of consciousness that interpenetrates physical matter but operates according to laws that transcend the ordinary limitations of space and time. They describe systematic methods for expanding awareness beyond the boundaries of individual identity, for perceiving the geometric patterns that underlie all creation, for communicating directly with what the ancient scribes called the intelligence that dreams the world into existence. Lorenzo, whose mind combines the practical genius of a banker with the soaring imagination of a poet, immediately grasps the implications. If human beings truly possess such potential, then the greatest investment he could make would not be in trade routes or political alliances, but in the systematic development of human consciousness itself. If the techniques described in these texts could produce individuals capable of transcendent awareness and divine creativity, then supporting such development would ultimately transform not just art and philosophy, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. Thus begins the most extraordinary patronage program in Renaissance history, one that will funnel vast Medici resources not just to artists and scholars studying classical Greek and Roman sources, but to a secret network of researchers working to decode and apply the most advanced consciousness development technologies preserved from ancient Egypt. The first and most crucial of these scholars was Marsilio Ficino, a brilliant philosopher whose public work on Platonic philosophy masked a far more revolutionary private project. While the world knew Ficino as the translator of Plato's complete works and the author of influential treatises on love and beauty, his most important accomplishment remained hidden: the systematic decoding of Egyptian consciousness expansion techniques under the direct patronage and protection of Lorenzo de' Medici. Ficino's public masterwork, his translation of the Corpus Hermeticum, texts attributed to the legendary Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus, represented only the surface layer of his actual research. While scholars and churchmen debated the theological implications of Hermetic philosophy, Ficino was secretly working with original Egyptian papyri provided through Vatican channels, documents that contained far more specific and practical information than anything in the publicly available Hermetic texts. His private correspondence, written in a cipher that combined Hebrew letters with alchemical symbols, reveals the extraordinary scope of his secret studies. In letters to Lorenzo and other trusted associates, Ficino used the code phrase, "The phoenix burns in silence," to indicate that he was reporting on his work with the most sensitive Egyptian materials, texts that described not just philosophical concepts, but precise techniques for achieving what the ancients called resurrection of the solar body, while still inhabiting physical form. "My beloved Lorenzo," reads one such letter, deciphered only in 1987 by Vatican cryptographers, "the phoenix burns in silence, and in that burning, I have discovered methods for expanding human awareness that surpass anything described in Plato or Plotinus." The Egyptian texts speak not of philosophy, but of applied science, systematic procedures for developing capabilities that Christians attribute to divine grace alone. Through careful practice of their meditation techniques, combined with specific breathing patterns, and the use of geometric forms to focus consciousness. I have achieved states of awareness in which the boundaries between self and cosmos dissolve into unity that is simultaneously utterly personal and completely universal. What Ficino had discovered, with Vatican support and Medici funding, was that Egyptian magic was actually sophisticated consciousness technology, methods for systematically developing human potential that had been perfected over millennia of temple-based research and refined through generations of carefully trained practitioners. Working in a secret laboratory established in the basement of the Medici Palace, Ficino began testing these ancient techniques with a small group of trusted associates. Using crystals cut according to Egyptian specifications, incense formulated from recipes preserved in Vatican archives, and meditation practices derived directly from temple training manuals, this group achieved results that seemed miraculous to Renaissance understanding, but were simply the predictable outcomes of applying systematic consciousness development methods. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, the brilliant young philosopher who would later write his famous Oration on the Dignity of Man, was among Ficino's secret students. His public celebration of human potential drew directly from experiences achieved through Egyptian techniques that revealed consciousness to be far more malleable and powerful than Christian theology had ever acknowledged. Botticelli's transcendent paintings of divine beauty were inspired not just by Platonic philosophy, but by visions experienced during meditation practices that Ficino had adapted from Egyptian temple protocols. The otherworldly luminosity that characterizes Botticelli's angels and goddesses reflects his direct perception of what the Egyptian texts called the bodies of light that surround and interpenetrate physical forms. Even Michelangelo, though he never studied directly with Ficino, was influenced by the consciousness expansion techniques that were spreading through Renaissance artistic circles. His famous description of sculpture as liberating the form that already exists within the marble perfectly captures the Egyptian understanding of creative work as the revelation of divine patterns that exist in potential within all matter. But it was Lorenzo himself who achieved the most remarkable results from this secret curriculum of consciousness development. Contemporary accounts describe a transformation in the Medici leader that seemed to transcend mere political or artistic accomplishment. Visitors to Florence reported that Lorenzo possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the intentions and character of those around him, to perceive the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated events, and to make decisions based on insights that proved accurate far beyond the reach of normal analysis. What they were witnessing was the systematic application of Egyptian techniques for developing what the ancient texts called the Eye of Horus, expanded perceptual abilities that allowed trained practitioners to perceive patterns and connections invisible to ordinary consciousness. Lorenzo's legendary success as a diplomat, his uncanny ability to navigate the complex political currents of Renaissance Italy, and his talent for identifying and nurturing genius in others all flowed from capabilities he had developed through secret study of consciousness, expansion methods preserved from ancient Egypt. The success of the Florentine experiment encouraged similar projects throughout Renaissance Europe, all funded through channels that connected back to Vatican sources and all dedicated to the practical application of Egyptian wisdom in contemporary contexts. In Rome itself, the most ambitious of these experiments was conducted under the direct supervision of Pope Alexander VI, the notorious Borgia Pope, whose public reputation for corruption masked a far more complex relationship with forbidden knowledge. On the night of June 23, 1495, in chambers deep beneath the Apostolic Palace, Pope Alexander VI presided over what may have been the most extraordinary ceremonial working ever conducted within Vatican walls, using procedures described in the Leiden Papyrus, one of the most powerful Egyptian magical texts in the Church's possession. The Pope and a select group of cardinals attempted to invoke what the ancient text called the Assembly of the Luminous Ones. According to eyewitness accounts preserved in documents that were immediately classified and sealed, the ceremony achieved results that defied every assumption about the nature of spiritual reality. As Alexander VI intoned invocations in ancient Egyptian, while his assistants positioned crystals and burning herbs according to specifications preserved in the Leiden text, the papal chambers filled with what witnesses could only describe as spirits of light, luminous beings whose presence radiated intelligence, compassion, and knowledge that seemed to encompass the entire sweep of human history. Cardinal Cesare Borgia, the Pope's son, wrote in his private diary, "The beings that manifested spoke to us without words, communicating directly mind to mind in ways that transcended language itself. They confirmed what the Egyptian texts had suggested, that human consciousness is capable of evolution that makes our current state seem like childhood compared to mature adulthood. They showed us visions of humanity's potential future, of civilizations that had learned to live in harmony with cosmic intelligence, of individuals who had developed abilities that we would consider godlike. The beings allegedly provided specific guidance on matters of church policy, diplomatic strategy, and spiritual development that proved so valuable that Alexander VI continued to conduct similar invocations throughout his papacy." The remarkable success of Vatican diplomacy during the Borgia period, the Church's ability to navigate the complex political challenges posed by emerging nation-states, and Alexander's talent for staying ahead of his enemies, all reflected information and insights gained through these secret communications with intelligences that claim to have guided human civilization since its earliest beginnings. Yet perhaps the most significant outcome of these Renaissance experiments with Egyptian wisdom was their influence on the scientific revolution that would transform European understanding of natural law. Unknown to most historians, many of the period's greatest scientific breakthroughs emerged directly from research programs that combined experimental investigation with consciousness, expansion techniques derived from Egyptian sources. Isaac Newton, whose mathematical description of physical reality laid the foundation for modern science, spent more time studying alchemy than physics, and his alchemical research was based entirely on formulations that traced back to Vatican-protected Egyptian texts. Newton's private papers, most of which remain sealed in university archives to this day, reveal that he understood his mathematical laws as approximations of deeper principles that could only be fully grasped through direct consciousness expansion. His famous statement that, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants," referred not just to his debt to previous scientists, but to his systematic study of Egyptian consciousness development methods that allowed him to perceive mathematical relationships through direct intuitive insight, rather than just logical deduction. Newton's ability to intuit the fundamental laws of physics reflected his application of Egyptian techniques for expanding awareness beyond the limitations of ordinary sensory perception. Galileo's revolutionary improvements to telescope design were inspired by his secret study of Egyptian optical texts that described the construction of instruments for seeing the invisible. Vatican archives contain correspondence between Galileo and church scholars that reveals the astronomer had access to ancient Egyptian treatises on optics that wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream science for another 3 centuries. The Church's seemingly contradictory relationship with Galileo, condemning his astronomical theories while secretly consulting him on Egyptian celestial mechanics, makes perfect sense when understood in the context of Vatican knowledge about ancient Egyptian astronomical achievements. Church scholars had long known that Egyptian priests had mapped the stars with accuracy that surpassed contemporary European astronomy, had calculated the precession of the equinoxes millennia before Copernicus, and had encoded sophisticated astronomical knowledge in monument alignments that modern archaeology is only beginning to appreciate. When Galileo's telescopic observations confirmed that ancient Egyptian astronomical texts contained accurate information about celestial phenomena invisible to naked eye observation, Vatican authorities found themselves in an impossible position. They could not publicly acknowledge the accuracy of Egyptian astronomical knowledge without revealing the extent of their secret archives, yet they could not ignore the obvious implications of Galileo's discoveries for their understanding of ancient Egyptian capabilities. The solution they adopted, publicly condemning Galileo while privately supporting astronomical research, established a pattern that would characterize Vatican policy throughout the scientific revolution. Church authorities publicly maintained the fiction that ancient civilizations were primitive and superstitious, while secretly using knowledge derived from those same civilizations to advance European understanding of natural law. Johannes Kepler's discovery of elliptical planetary orbits emerged from his study of Egyptian astronomical texts that described planetary motion in terms of the dance of the gods around the eternal fire. Kepler's mystical language about the music of the spheres directly reflected Egyptian descriptions of the cosmos as a vast musical composition in which planetary movements created harmonic frequencies that could be perceived by consciousness expanded beyond ordinary limitations. The development of the scientific method itself owed more to Egyptian influence than mainstream history acknowledges. The systematic observation, hypothesis formation, and experimental testing that characterizes modern science follows procedures outlined in Egyptian texts that describe the investigation of natural law as a sacred practice requiring both intellectual rigor and expanded consciousness. Francis Bacon's New Organon, which established the philosophical foundation for empirical science, was heavily influenced by his secret study of Egyptian texts that described systematic methods for investigating the hidden principles that govern natural phenomena. Bacon's famous statement that knowledge is power echoed Egyptian understanding that consciousness expansion necessarily leads to increased ability to influence physical reality. By the early 17th century, the combination of Renaissance humanism, scientific revolution methodology, and secret application of Egyptian consciousness development techniques had created an intellectual climate that seemed poised to revolutionize human understanding of reality itself. European civilization appeared to be on the verge of rediscovering and systematically applying wisdom that had been preserved in hidden form for more than a millennium. Yet this very success created unprecedented challenges for Vatican authorities, who had spent centuries balancing public orthodoxy with private experimentation. As Egyptian-influenced discoveries transformed European understanding of astronomy, physics, medicine, and human potential, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that ancient wisdom was primitive superstition, unworthy of serious consideration. The stage was being set for a period of unprecedented tension within church hierarchy, as reformist elements pushed for greater openness about ancient wisdom, while conservative factions insisted on maintaining traditional secrecy. The question that would dominate Vatican policy debates for the next century was becoming impossible to avoid. If Egyptian knowledge was producing such remarkable results when applied in secret, what would happen if it were revealed to the world? The answer would emerge through a series of events that would test the Church's commitment to secrecy as never before, as the very success of Renaissance consciousness development experiments began to produce individuals whose abilities transcended anything that could be explained by conventional religious doctrine. The Vatican was about to discover that some forms of knowledge, once unleashed, become impossible to control, and that the greatest fear of those who guard forbidden wisdom is not that it will be rejected, but that it will be embraced with revolutionary enthusiasm that transforms everything it touches. In the shadows of Renaissance palaces, candles burn beside manuscripts that have awakened human potential beyond anything medieval Europe had imagined possible. And in that awakening, the ancient Egyptian promise of human divine transcendence begins to emerge from centuries of secrecy into the light of conscious application, setting the stage for revelations that would force the Church to confront its deepest fears about what humanity might become if it truly understood the magnificent nature of its own consciousness. Vatican City, October 1962. In a conference room deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica, 67 of the Church's most senior officials gather for what the official records will describe as a theological consultation on contemporary challenges. But the real agenda, recorded in classified minutes that were briefly leaked in 1989 before being immediately suppressed, concerns a crisis of faith so profound that it threatens to shake the Catholic Church to its foundations. The Second Vatican Council is unfolding in public sessions above their heads, debating reforms that will modernize the Church for the 20th century. But down here, in chambers where even the Council Fathers dare not venture, Church leaders confront a question that makes debates about Latin liturgy and clerical celibacy seem trivial by comparison. What if the Egyptian knowledge they have guarded for 17 centuries proves that Christianity is not humanity's first encounter with divine revelation, but merely its most recent? Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, the stern defender of Orthodox doctrine who serves as Secretary of the Holy Office, reads aloud from internal memos that have been circulating among the Church's most trusted scholars. His voice, normally resonant with unshakable conviction, trembles as he recites conclusions that would have been unthinkable to previous generations of Church leaders. Based on carbon dating analysis completed in 1961, we must acknowledge that Egyptian texts in Vatican archives describe resurrection techniques that predate Christ's resurrection by 15 centuries. These are not symbolic accounts or mythological allegories, but systematic procedures that appear to have been successfully applied by ancient practitioners. If these techniques represent genuine spiritual science rather than primitive superstition, then our foundational claim to unique divine revelation requires fundamental reconsideration. The silence that follows this statement stretches for nearly a full minute. A minute during which men who have devoted their lives to absolute certainty about divine truth grapple with evidence that challenges their most basic assumptions. When Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger finally speaks, his words carry the weight of a brilliant theological mind confronting the unthinkable. Your Eminence, we face a crisis that extends beyond questions of historical precedence. Our own experimental applications of Egyptian consciousness expansion techniques have produced results that surpass anything achievable through conventional prayer or contemplation. Cardinals in this room have developed healing abilities, expanded perceptual capabilities, and direct communication experiences that would have been considered miraculous by previous generations. Yet these achievements flow not from divine grace, but from systematic application of methods that predate Christian revelation. The implications hang in the air like smoke from extinguished candles. If human beings can develop godlike abilities through ancient Egyptian training rather than Christian faith, what happens to the doctrine of salvation through Christ alone? If consciousness can be systematically expanded to achieve direct communication with divine intelligence, what role remains for the Church as mediator between God and humanity? Pope John XXIII, whose public image of gentle pastoral reform conceals one of the sharpest theological minds of his generation, cuts to the heart of the matter with characteristic precision. Gentlemen, we are not debating abstract theological questions. We are confronting evidence that human beings may possess divine potential that makes our entire institutional structure either unnecessary or actively harmful to spiritual development. The question we must answer is not whether this evidence is accurate. Our own experiments have confirmed its validity repeatedly. The question is whether humanity is prepared for knowledge that could transform every individual into their own priest, their own healer, their own direct conduit to divine wisdom. To understand the magnitude of this crisis, consider a parallel from American culture. Imagine if archaeologists at the Smithsonian Institution discovered incontrovertible evidence that extraterrestrial beings had visited Earth repeatedly throughout history, had provided advanced technology to ancient civilizations, and had left behind instruction manuals for achieving interstellar travel and extending human lifespan indefinitely. Imagine further that religious leaders worldwide had agreed to suppress this evidence, fearing that its revelation would destroy existing social structures and plunge humanity into chaos. The psychological pressure on those who carried such secrets would be immense. They would face the daily challenge of maintaining public positions based on information they knew to be incomplete or inaccurate. They would struggle with the moral implications of withholding knowledge that could revolutionize human civilization. Most painfully, they would grapple with the question of whether their protective secrecy served humanity's best interests or merely preserved their own institutional authority. This is precisely the situation that Vatican leaders have faced for centuries, but the pressure reached unprecedented levels during the 1960s, as scientific advances made the Church's hidden knowledge increasingly difficult to dismiss as ancient superstition. Archaeological discoveries were confirming the sophistication of Egyptian civilization. Psychological research was validating consciousness expansion techniques that bore striking resemblances to methods described in Vatican archives. Most disturbing of all, quantum physics was beginning to describe reality in terms that perfectly matched ancient Egyptian teachings, about the fundamental role of consciousness in shaping physical experience. The leaked 1962 memo reveals the specific concerns that kept church leaders awake during the council years. Egyptian texts described healing techniques based on understanding of human energy fields that wouldn't be validated by medical science until the development of electromagnetic field detection equipment in the 1980s. They contained astronomical information that proved ancient Egyptians possessed knowledge of celestial mechanics that exceeded contemporary understanding. Most troubling of all, they presented systematic methods for achieving what could only be described as direct communication with cosmic intelligence. Communication that provided information and guidance that consistently proved more accurate than conventional human reasoning. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Montini, who would later become Pope Paul VI, summarized the dilemma in words that capture the existential terror facing church leadership. We have preserved for centuries knowledge that could heal every disease, end every war, and elevate human consciousness to levels that would make saints of ordinary believers. Yet we dare not reveal it because we fear that humanity lacks the spiritual maturity to use such power responsibly. Are we protecting the world from dangerous knowledge, or are we protecting ourselves from a world that no longer needs our guidance? This question struck at the heart of institutional Christianity's deepest insecurities. If ancient Egyptians had developed systematic methods for achieving direct divine communication, for healing through consciousness alone, for transcending the limitations of ordinary human awareness, then what unique value did Christian revelation provide? If these capabilities were humanity's natural birthright, rather than gifts reserved for divine incarnation, then what justified the Church's role as exclusive mediator between God and human souls? The psychological pressure of grappling with such questions began to manifest in increasingly visible ways throughout the Catholic hierarchy. By the 1970s, Vatican observers noted that many senior church officials seemed to be struggling with what psychologists would recognize as cognitive dissonance, the mental stress that results from holding contradictory beliefs simultaneously. Cardinals who publicly defended traditional doctrine began making private statements that suggested radically different understandings of spiritual reality. Seminary professors who taught conventional theology in classroom settings were privately developing curricula that incorporated consciousness expansion techniques derived from Egyptian sources. Even papal statements began to contain subtle acknowledgements that divine revelation might be more complex and multifaceted than traditional Christian teaching had suggested. Pope Paul VI's famous 1975 statement that the Church must be prepared to encounter truth in forms that challenge our conventional expectations was widely interpreted as a reference to interfaith dialogue and scientific discoveries. Those familiar with Vatican internal documents understood it as acknowledgement that the Church possessed knowledge that could fundamentally alter human understanding of spiritual reality. By the 1980s, the pressure for some form of disclosure was becoming impossible to ignore. Vatican astronomers, working with state-of-the-art telescopes and computers, were discovering that ancient Egyptian astronomical texts contained information that shouldn't have been available to pre-technological civilizations. Church medical researchers, studying consciousness-based healing techniques in controlled clinical settings, were achieving results that exceeded anything possible through conventional medicine. Most remarkably, Vatican scholars working with Egyptian consciousness expansion protocols were developing abilities that would have been considered supernatural by previous generations, but appeared to represent the systematic activation of latent human potential. A confidential survey conducted among Vatican astronomers in 1987 revealed that 47% were privately studying what the survey euphemistically called alternative spirituality, practices derived from Egyptian, Hindu, and Buddhist sources that seem to produce more reliable spiritual experiences than traditional Christian contemplative methods. When asked whether they believed ancient civilizations possessed advanced spiritual knowledge that modern Christianity had forgotten, 63% answered affirmatively. The survey results were so disturbing to church authorities that all copies were immediately classified, and the researchers involved were reassigned to positions that limited their contact with each other and with outside scholars. Yet the underlying reality that the survey revealed could not be suppressed. The Church's own experts were privately acknowledging that ancient wisdom traditions contained spiritual technologies that surpassed anything available through conventional Christian practice. Pope John Paul II, whose public image combined traditional Catholic doctrine with openness to modern science, struggled throughout his pontificate with the growing pressure to acknowledge Vatican knowledge about ancient spiritual wisdom. His private writings, portions of which were briefly accessible during archival reorganization in 1998, reveal a man torn between institutional loyalty and intellectual honesty. I find myself in the impossible position of defending doctrines that I know to be incomplete while possessing knowledge that could transform human understanding of divine reality, he wrote in a journal entry dated March 15, 1987. We have proven through our own experiments that human consciousness is capable of expansion that makes our current spiritual achievements seem primitive. We have validated ancient techniques for healing, for expanded perception, for direct communication with cosmic intelligence. Yet we dare not share this knowledge because we fear its implications for established religious authority. The internal conflict that John Paul II articulated so poignantly affected Vatican operations at every level. Priests trained in conventional seminary programs found themselves inadequately prepared to guide parishioners who were spontaneously developing expanded consciousness through meditation, yoga, and other practices that bore striking resemblances to techniques described in Egyptian texts. Bishops struggled to maintain doctrinal authority while privately acknowledging that ancient wisdom traditions seemed to produce more consistent spiritual results than traditional Christian methods. Perhaps most tellingly, Vatican diplomatic efforts increasingly reflected insights and capabilities that could only have been developed through systematic application of consciousness expansion techniques. Church negotiators demonstrated uncanny abilities to understand the hidden motivations of their counterparts, to predict political developments with remarkable accuracy, and to craft agreements that served interests that weren't immediately apparent to outside observers. When Pope Francis was elected in 2013, many Vatican insiders hoped that his reputation for openness and reform might finally create conditions for some degree of disclosure about ancient knowledge. His background in chemistry and his experience with Latin American liberation theology seemed to suggest a leader who might be comfortable acknowledging that spiritual truth could emerge through multiple channels rather than exclusively through Christian revelation. Yet even Francis appears to struggle with the implications of Vatican knowledge about ancient wisdom traditions. His 2019 statement that truth has many faces, some we're not ready to see, was widely interpreted as a reference to interfaith dialogue and scientific discoveries. Those familiar with Vatican internal documents understood it as acknowledgement that the Church possesses truth that it considers too dangerous or revolutionary to share with the broader world. The psychological toll of maintaining such secrets across generations of Church leadership cannot be overstated. Cardinals and popes have spent their entire careers defending positions that they privately knew to be incomplete or inaccurate. They have watched humanity struggle with problems that could be solved using knowledge locked away in Vatican archives. They have seen individuals achieve remarkable spiritual development through ancient techniques while maintaining the fiction that such methods are either ineffective or dangerous. The emotional weight of this deception creates what psychologists call moral injury, the psychological damage that results from perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that violate fundamental moral beliefs. Church leaders who entered their vocations believing they were serving humanity's higher spiritual interests find themselves complicit in withholding knowledge that could accelerate human spiritual evolution beyond anything previously imagined. This moral injury manifests in various ways throughout the Church hierarchy. Some leaders become increasingly rigid and defensive, interpreting any challenge to traditional doctrine as a personal attack on their integrity and service. Others withdraw into private study and contemplation, finding it increasingly difficult to participate in public ceremonies that they perceive as incomplete representations of spiritual reality. Still others begin to drop subtle hints about deeper knowledge, testing whether their audiences might be prepared for more revolutionary revelations. But perhaps the most profound emotional challenge facing Vatican leadership is the recognition that their protective secrecy may have become counterproductive. In an age when information travels instantly around the globe, when scientific discoveries are rapidly validating ancient wisdom claims, when individuals are spontaneously developing expanded consciousness through practices they learn from books and internet videos, the Church's policy of absolute secrecy about ancient knowledge begins to seem not just unnecessary, but actively harmful. The fear that has driven Vatican secrecy for centuries, the fear that revealing advanced spiritual knowledge would destroy existing social structures and plunge humanity into chaos, now competes with a different fear. The fear that withholding such knowledge, while the world faces unprecedented challenges, might represent a greater sin than sharing it, despite the risks involved. This is not a question of good versus evil in any conventional sense. The Church leaders who have maintained these secrets for generations are not villains seeking to harm humanity. They are individuals who genuinely believe they are protecting the world from knowledge it isn't ready to handle responsibly. Their fear is not selfish but altruistic. They worry that revealing techniques for expanding human consciousness beyond normal limitations could lead to misuse, manipulation, and catastrophic social disruption. Yet as the 21st century progresses and humanity faces challenges that conventional approaches seem unable to address, environmental degradation, social inequality, psychological suffering on unprecedented scales, the question becomes increasingly urgent. Is humanity's lack of readiness for advanced spiritual knowledge more dangerous than its continued ignorance of capabilities that could transform civilization for the better? The answer to that question will determine whether the Vatican's 17th century policy of protective secrecy continues into the future, or whether the time has finally come for humanity to reclaim the knowledge of its own divine potential that has been preserved in the deepest archives beneath St. Peter's Basilica. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Vatican City rests in silence and shadows, the weight of this decision presses upon those who guard the world's most dangerous secrets. They know that the knowledge they protect could heal humanity's deepest wounds and awaken capabilities that would make the Renaissance seem like a mere prelude to human greatness. They also know that once such knowledge is released, there will be no controlling how it spreads or how it might be used. The next chapter of this extraordinary story will be written by leaders who must decide whether faith in humanity's wisdom outweighs fear of its potential for folly, and whether the time has come to trust the species that created the pyramids, mapped the stars, and preserved the techniques for conscious evolution with the full knowledge of its own magnificent nature. Imagine waking tomorrow morning to news that would transform human civilization forever. Picture the headlines scrolling across your phone. Pope Francis opens all Vatican vaults. Ancient Egyptian texts released to world. Imagine the flood of documents that follows. Papyri describing consciousness transfer techniques that could revolutionize neuroscience, healing frequencies that quantum physics suddenly recognizes as applications of field theory. It's only beginning to understand detailed instructions for what the ancient texts call dimensional communication, with intelligences that exist beyond ordinary space-time limitations. What happens in the 24 hours that follow such a revelation? What happens in the weeks and months and years after humanity suddenly gains access to knowledge that could transform every aspect of human experience? The cascading consequences would unfold like dominoes falling in slow motion, each revelation triggering a chain reaction that reshapes our understanding of reality itself. Within hours, research teams at Harvard, Cambridge, MIT, and the CERN laboratories in Switzerland would be analyzing texts that describe the universe in terms that make quantum mechanics seem elementary. Physicians at Johns Hopkins and the Mayo Clinic would be studying Egyptian medical papyri that treat human consciousness as the fundamental healing agent, capable of directing cellular regeneration through precisely calibrated intention and sound frequency. The medical revolution alone would dwarf every breakthrough in human history. Imagine emergency rooms where doctors use Egyptian sound healing techniques to accelerate tissue repair, where frequencies described in 3,000-year-old texts prove more effective than surgery for treating certain conditions, where the systematic consciousness expansion methods preserved in Vatican archives begin training physicians to diagnose illness through direct perception of human energy fields. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Chief of Neurology at Stanford Medical Center, this is hypothetical, but based on conversations with researchers who have glimpsed fragments of this knowledge, might find herself reading Egyptian texts that describe the brain not as the source of consciousness, but as its focusing device. Consciousness itself being a field phenomenon that interpenetrates but transcends physical tissue. The implications for treating depression, schizophrenia, and neurodegenerative diseases would be staggering. We've been treating the radio instead of understanding the signal, she might tell her colleagues as she studies papyri that describe systematic methods for expanding awareness beyond the limitations of individual neural networks. These texts suggest that consciousness disorders aren't brain malfunctions, but misalignments between individual awareness and cosmic intelligence fields that we're only now learning to detect scientifically. The religious upheaval would be equally dramatic and infinitely more complex. Within days of disclosure, every major faith tradition would face questions that strike at the heart of their exclusivity claims. If ancient Egyptians possessed systematic techniques for achieving direct communication with divine intelligence, what happens to Christianity's claim to unique revelation? If Buddhist meditation practices, Hindu yoga, and Islamic Sufism all trace back to Egyptian consciousness technologies, what does that say about religious diversity versus religious truth? Cardinal Sarah Martinez, again, hypothetical but representative, might find herself explaining to confused Catholics that the Church has long known that divine revelation operates through multiple channels. We preserved this knowledge, she might say in emergency broadcasts, not to hide it from humanity, but to protect it until humanity was ready to use it wisely. The techniques described in these texts don't diminish Christ's message. They help us understand how Christ's consciousness could perform miracles that seemed impossible to ordinary human awareness. But not everyone would welcome such explanations. Fundamentalist groups across all traditions might reject the revelations entirely, insisting that their particular scriptures remain the only valid source of spiritual truth. Others might fragment into competing interpretations of what the Egyptian texts really mean. Still, others might embrace the knowledge so enthusiastically that they abandon traditional religious structures entirely, forming new communities dedicated to direct application of ancient consciousness expansion techniques. The scientific breakthrough implications stretch beyond medicine into realms that would reshape our understanding of physics, astronomy, and the nature of reality itself. Researchers at the European Space Agency might discover that Egyptian astronomical texts contain star maps that show celestial phenomena invisible to current telescopes, suggesting observational capabilities that transcend normal human perception. Quantum physicists might find that Egyptian descriptions of consciousness-matter interaction provide theoretical frameworks that resolve paradoxes that have puzzled science for decades. Professor James Chen at Berkeley, hypothetical but based on real researchers who've glimpsed this material, might spend sleepless nights studying Egyptian texts that describe what they call the observer frequency, specific states of consciousness that can influence quantum measurements in ways that validate the most radical interpretations of quantum theory. They're not describing magic, he might tell his graduate students. They're describing applied quantum consciousness research that we're only now sophisticated enough to understand scientifically. But perhaps the most profound transformation would be social and political. Power structures throughout human civilization are built on the assumption that knowledge is scarce, that expertise requires special training, that ordinary people need institutions to mediate their relationship with truth. If Egyptian texts reveal that consciousness expansion is humanity's natural birthright, that healing abilities can be systematically developed by anyone willing to undertake proper training, that direct communication with cosmic intelligence requires no priestly mediation, then the foundations of institutional authority crumble overnight. Governments would face populations who no longer need to be governed in traditional ways. Educational systems would confront students who could learn directly through consciousness expansion rather than rote memorization. Medical establishments would find patients who could heal themselves through techniques that require no expensive technology or pharmaceutical intervention. Religious organizations would minister to congregations who could achieve direct spiritual experience without institutional guidance. The economic implications alone would revolutionize global civilization. If Egyptian energy manipulation techniques prove capable of producing unlimited clean power, if their matter transformation methods can solve scarcity by creating abundance from basic elements, if their transportation technologies can move objects through space-time manipulation rather than chemical propulsion, then everything we understand about resource limitations and economic competition becomes obsolete. Yet amid these world-shaking transformations, the most personal revolution might occur within your own consciousness, your spiritual journey, every prayer that has seemed to go unanswered, every moment of doubt about divine reality, every search for meaning that has left you feeling isolated and confused, might suddenly make sense in ways you never imagined possible. The Egyptian texts describe human consciousness not as a biological accident in a meaningless universe, but as a fragment of cosmic intelligence temporarily focused through individual awareness for the purpose of experiencing creation from every possible perspective. Your struggles with meditation, your longing for transcendent experience, your intuitive sense that reality contains dimensions beyond ordinary perception, all of these might be revealed as natural responses to your true nature trying to remember itself. Imagine discovering that every moment of spiritual yearning you've ever experienced was actually your consciousness, trying to expand beyond the artificial limitations that culture and conditioning have imposed upon it. Imagine learning that the techniques for achieving the mystical states you've read about in spiritual books have been preserved in systematic detail, waiting in Vatican archives for humanity to become ready to reclaim its divine birthright. The practices themselves might prove surprisingly accessible. Egyptian consciousness expansion techniques, according to Vatican researchers who've studied them, don't require years of ascetic discipline or special genetic gifts. They operate through understanding of natural laws that govern the relationship between awareness and reality, laws that can be learned and applied by anyone willing to invest the time and attention required for systematic training. Dr. Sarah Kim, a hypothetical psychologist but representative of researchers who've glimpsed this material, might find herself teaching workshops where participants learn Egyptian breathing techniques that alter brainwave patterns in ways that produce reliable, mystical experiences. We're not inducing hallucinations, she might explain to skeptical colleagues. We're teaching people to access states of consciousness that reveal aspects of reality normally filtered out by everyday awareness. The Egyptians understood that mystical experience isn't supernatural. It's simply natural perception operating at frequencies we've forgotten how to access. As months pass following this hypothetical disclosure, humanity might witness the emergence of a new kind of civilization. One where individual consciousness development becomes as important as technological advancement, where healing happens through understanding of energy principles rather than chemical intervention, where education focuses on expanding awareness rather than accumulating information. Universities might establish departments of applied consciousness studies, teaching Egyptian techniques alongside quantum physics and molecular biology. Hospitals might integrate sound healing chambers with surgical suites and intensive care units. Even governments might restructure themselves around principles that recognize consciousness expansion as a legitimate component of human development and social policy. Yet this transformation wouldn't be without challenges and dangers. The same knowledge that could heal could also be perverted into new forms of manipulation and control. Consciousness expansion techniques could be misused by those seeking power over others rather than service to human evolution. The collapse of traditional authority structures could lead to chaos and conflict as different groups compete to define how ancient wisdom should be applied in modern contexts. Perhaps most challenging of all would be the psychological adjustment required as humanity grapples with a completely transformed understanding of its place in the cosmos. Learning that consciousness is fundamental to reality rather than emergent from matter, that human beings possess divine potential that makes current achievement seem primitive, that death might be a transitional experience rather than final termination. Such revelations would challenge everything that modern culture takes for granted, about the nature and purpose of human existence. The Vatican's current position, as reflected in recent statements from church officials, suggests that such disclosure might happen gradually rather than suddenly. Cardinal Luis Ladaria, prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, made a cryptic comment in 2023 that Vatican insiders interpret as preparation for eventual revelation. The Church has always understood that truth reveals itself in stages appropriate to humanity's capacity for understanding. We may be approaching a stage where humanity is ready for revelations that will test the foundations of faith itself. Such statements suggest that Vatican leaders are actively debating whether the time has come to begin sharing knowledge that has been preserved in secret for nearly 2 millennia. They face the same question that has haunted church leadership for centuries. Is humanity finally ready for wisdom that could transform civilization, or would such revelations cause more harm than benefit? The answer may depend on whether we can demonstrate the maturity and wisdom necessary to use transformative knowledge responsibly. As we face global challenges that seem beyond the reach of conventional solutions, climate change, social inequality, psychological suffering on unprecedented scales, the question becomes whether access to consciousness expansion technologies might be exactly what humanity needs to transcend the limitations that have created these problems. Your own spiritual journey, your own search for meaning and connection, your own intuitive sense that reality contains more than meets the eye. All of these might be preparation for discoveries that could revolutionize not just your personal understanding, but the trajectory of human civilization itself. The knowledge that could transform your prayers from hope into experience, your doubts into understanding, your search for meaning into direct communion with the intelligence that dreams the universe into existence. That knowledge rests in archives beneath your feet, waiting for the moment when humanity proves ready to remember the magnificent nature of its own consciousness. And so, friends, our journey through the Vatican's deepest secrets draws to its close. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let your consciousness wander through those marble corridors we've explored together, halls that echo with centuries of footsteps, each one belonging to someone who carried the weight of impossible knowledge. Picture those iron doors standing sentinel over wisdom older than empires, older than the very foundations of Rome itself. Behind each lock, scrolls of papyrus that could rewrite human understanding of consciousness, of reality, of our own divine potential. In those sealed chambers, candles burn beside texts that whisper of technologies of the soul, of methods for awakening capabilities that would make miracles seem ordinary, of knowledge that could transform every human being into something approaching the gods themselves. The question that has haunted every pope, every cardinal, every keeper of these secrets across 17 centuries remains with us still. Are we ready? Are we truly ready for wisdom that could heal every disease, that could expand every consciousness, that could reveal the magnificent nature of human potential in ways that would forever change how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos? Perhaps the Vatican isn't hiding this knowledge from us, friends. Perhaps they're protecting us from knowledge we're not yet evolved enough to handle with the wisdom and compassion it demands. Knowledge of consciousness transfer could become the ultimate tool of control. Techniques for dimensional communication could open doorways to realms we lack the spiritual maturity to navigate safely. Methods for manipulating reality through pure intention could be perverted into weapons that make nuclear bombs seem like children's toys. Or perhaps they're protecting themselves from a truth that would make even the most faithful question everything they've ever believed. What happens to institutional Christianity if every human being discovers they can achieve direct communion with divine intelligence without church, without priest, without sacrament? What happens to religious authority when the faithful learn that the kingdom of heaven Christ spoke of isn't a distant promise, but a state of consciousness they can learn to enter through systematic training preserved from ancient Egypt? Voice dropping to barely audible whisper, the scrolls wait in their climate-controlled chambers, patient as only ancient wisdom can be patient. The hieroglyphs continue to dance in candlelight, spelling out secrets that could revolutionize human civilization or destroy it utterly. The guardians continue their eternal vigil, wrestling with questions that have no easy answers. carrying burdens that would crush lesser souls. And you, dear listener, drift now toward dreams that might carry echoes of the knowledge we've glimpsed tonight. In your sleep, perhaps you'll find yourself walking those marble halls, breathing air thick with the weight of preserved mysteries. Perhaps you'll touch those iron doors and feel the power that pulses behind them. Knowledge that calls to something deep within your consciousness. Something that remembers when humanity walked freely between the worlds of matter and spirit. Thank you, friends, for joining me on this journey into the Vatican's most guarded secrets. If tonight's revelations have stirred something within your soul, if they've awakened questions about the nature of your own consciousness and potential, then please consider subscribing to our channel. Like this video if it's opened doorways in your understanding that you never knew existed. Share it with those you trust to handle knowledge that challenges everything we think we know about reality itself. Your support allows us to continue exploring these hidden histories, to keep excavating truths that have been buried beneath centuries of silence and secrecy. Together, we can illuminate the shadows of the past and perhaps discover that the future holds possibilities more magnificent than any of us have dared to imagine. Sweet dreams, friends. May your rest be undisturbed by visions of what lies beneath the marble floors of St. Peter's, waiting in the silence, waiting in the dark, waiting for the day when humanity proves worthy of the divine knowledge it has carried within itself since the time when the pyramids first reached toward the stars. The eternal guardian keeps its watch. The secrets rest in their sacred darkness. And somewhere in the depths of your own consciousness, perhaps something stirs. Something that remembers, something that knows, something that waits for you to discover the magnificent truth of what you really are. Until we meet again in the realm of hidden mysteries. Sleep well. Single church bell tolls once, the sound lingering in the air before fading to absolute silence. The end.